Chapter 21. Interlude Roman 3. The Competent Forsaken Subcommittee I. Chapter text Interlude Roman 3. The Competent Forsaken Subcommittee I. With a flicker, a woman appeared in the empty space, clothed in smart black trousers and jacket, a deep navy blouse underneath. Her black hair was in a bowl cut, and with big blue eyes, she cut an incongruous figure, looking more like she belonged in a boardroom than standing on a platform in a world of black nothingness. A moment later, another figure faded into being, a tall, hook-nosed man with an arrogant tilt to his jaw. His breeches and jacket were also black, made of fine, albeit plain cloth. He wore a silk white shirt underneath. He was swiftly followed by a third, a strikingly tall woman with pitch-black skin and short, wavy hair. Like the first two's outfits, her dress was also black as night. There was a moment while they surveyed each other, and then the empty surroundings faded away to be replaced by a brightly lit room. Glowing strips ran along the ceiling, casting a harsh white light onto a large table that appeared to be made of wood, but was as smooth and hard as polished stone. Now each of the three reclined in black leather chairs. The white walls of the room were only interrupted by a pitch-black rectangle in front of the table, and on another wall what seemed to be an abstract picture of some kind of red cuboid amidst strange buildings on a rainy day. The man raised his eyebrows at the new setting, ignoring the smaller woman's challenging stare. Maybe a bit too on the nose, but so be it. Let us keep this quick. We are all busy people. He nodded to the dark-skinned woman. Would you like to go first? The tall woman absent-mindedly shifted the papers that had appeared in front of her. The Cincian Empire is ripe for exploitation. Their social structures would fit well with the great lords, and I've had little difficulty in placing myself in a position of influence. A direct takeover is not a realistic option given their society, but I will have no trouble guiding them down the great lord's path. They both turned to the shorter woman, who took on a didactic tone. Like with the Cincian, an immediate takeover of these so-called Aes Sedai would be challenging. However, their black agenda is surprisingly widespread. It's far worse than during the war. Ishmael's efforts during his moments of freedom seem to have been very successful there. Several other of the chosen have been sniffing around here too, but while there are challenges even with these half-drained children, I'm confident that I'll be in a dominant position in no time. Excellent. The man nodded, but didn't smile. My own plans in the East are also progressing well. Their society is notably backwards, but full of conspiracy and hidden powers. That leaves it weak and vulnerable. So you have given up on the southern subcontinent then? The tall, dark-skinned woman raised her eyebrows. This land of madmen. Sadly, yes. It seems trying for that was an error of judgment. His face twisted at the admission. The name is not inaccurate. There is so little organization there that there was little to gain and much to lose. The East provides far better opportunities. So you didn't leave because you got into a losing battle with a pair of half-mad men and their angry lover. The shorter woman giggled and then quickly turned her laugh into a cough when the man gave her a look that promised murder. Anyway, it sounds like our plans are progressing well. What about the others? Do we have any intelligence on them? This time it was the dark-skinned woman who spoke up. Ishmael has been sniffing around the Cincian. At least when he is not pursuing those boys. I have not been able to work out what he's plotting, but he is up to some kind of scheme with their return. I shall be most put out if he obstructs it in some way. The other woman gave a musical laugh. If he wasn't up to something, he wouldn't be Ishmael. You'd have to be half mad to be able to fully understand what that man does. Sadly, you are right. She scowled. What about the others? This time the man spoke. Samuel has been leaving his base in Ilion and sniffing around in the borderlands. I have not been able to find out what he's scheming, but I would guess something to do with the armies there, perhaps preparing for when the blight truly awakens. He always did like playing with soldiers a bit too much. The shorter of the two women laughed. The light tone of her voice was a contrast to her companions, and she ignored the scowl from the man at her comment. I too have some interesting information to share. Lanfear has been in an absolute snit recently. We spoke a week ago, and she was fuming, barely holding on to her normal serene act. The taller woman leaned forward with a predatory smile at that. Do you know why she was so angry? Unfortunately not, she shrugged. I'm not stupid enough to ask her when she's in that kind of mood. If I had to guess, though, I'd think it's something to do with one of those boys Ishmael has been going on about. Presumably whichever one she thinks is Luz Thurin reborn, but really who knows? The rest of the Chosen can be bad enough, but that woman takes having your own agenda to a whole different level. Both women smirked, and the man's mouth twisted downward at that name. She continued to speak, giving the other two an amused smile. On a lighter note, I bumped into Asmodean recently, not that he knew it. He's been prancing around Tar Valon's inns, pretending to be a bard of some sort. His music's been the talk of the city, so I took the time to go and see a performance. He's even adapted some of his greatest hits for this age. I think he might be trying to inveigle his way into the White Tower, although only the great Lord knows how he thinks that'll work. To be honest, I think he's managed to get himself distracted by his adoring audiences. Not that I'd question the great Lord's judgment, but if that man wasn't so strong in the power, there's no way he would have been allowed to call himself chosen. Her laughter tinkled across the room, and even the other two seemed to be mildly amused. Anyway, it was a nice bit of nostalgia compared to the way these barbarians live, but if he keeps poking around the tower, I'll have to warn him off. She sat back and folded her arms, clearly finished. The tall woman immediately stood. Well, that was illuminating, but we all have much to be doing. If there is nothing else, neither of the other two spoke. Good, until next time. She abruptly vanished. The man gave the remaining woman a flat look. Next time I'll choose the venue. A second later, they both faded away too. Chapter 22. Living Among the Aes Sedai. Chapter text, chapter Roman 18. Living amongst the Aes Sedai as Taija had expected. It was a couple more days before the Amulin returned to Tar Valon. When she did, it was hard to miss. Not only did her procession parade noisily through the city's streets, it was all that people wanted to talk about. There was no recalcitrance in talking about Aes Sedai here, although every single person was also careful to only speak respectfully about them. The morning after the Seawan's return, the Lady Ulfreda of Houndstooth, a small village in the far west of Andor, presented herself at the White Tower with a request for an audience with the Amulin. A young lady in a white dress with a hem banded in 7 colors received Taija, supervising a scribe who noted down her details. She didn't look past her early 20s, although it could be hard to tell with channelers. However, that didn't stop her from looking Taija over as her details were taken, a slight hint of contempt in her eyes. It was enough to make Taija wince internally. She must have made some kind of mistake in her outfit. Hopefully claiming to be from a small village in the middle of nowhere would excuse her accent and dress. The careful wording of her request for an audience should also make sure that Siwan knew it was her. Taija sighed to herself when the young woman muttered something to the scribe. If she was going to be treated like a backwoods hick, this was going to be even less enjoyable than she was expecting. It was difficult, though. She'd never been overly interested in fashion in her own time, and despite the best efforts of the tailors she'd hired, this time's outfits still baffled her. What had been fashionable 3,000 years ago certainly wasn't not, which wasn't all that surprising when she thought about it. Still, whatever the young woman's thoughts, her words were faultlessly polite and directed Taija to a waiting area where refreshments would be provided, telling her that her petition would be taken to the Amulin. She also warned her that the Amulin was a busy woman and that it might be a long wait before an audience would be granted, perhaps several weeks or even months. The young woman's pride at being part of the tower showed through her tone, with just a hint of smugness underneath it. Taija gave her a polite smile, despite her irritation. "That's fine. I don't mind waiting. Thank you for your help." She definitely didn't consider tripping the young woman up with an inverted web of air. After the accepted had left, Taija sat there for an hour, then 2, then 3. Despite what she'd said, she was definitely getting irritated at the wait and her attempt at picking up a conversation with the other women looking for an audience, oddly there were no men, got nowhere. A nervous, elderly lady on her left just said, "Milady is too kind," and looked at her feet, while the other was staring determinedly ahead of herself, ignoring everyone. The girls training in the tower, accepted, and novices, that was what they called them, all seemed too busy to talk and regardless, were uninterested in a stranger who couldn't even channel. Taija had some sympathy with that. She could remember her own youth when she'd first been learning how to channel, and the sheer overwhelming excitement of it all. She'd barely been able to talk about anything else for at least the first couple of years. After a while, boredom overwhelming her paranoia, Taija closed her eyes and started working her way through a series of equations in her head, visualizing the symbols, their complex beauty, the way they described fundamental interactions in the universe. Eventually, even that lost its appeal, and she simply couldn't resist channeling. So Taija amused herself as she sat there, repeating the same exercises she'd learnt in her teens. A bit of nostalgia, and also just revision. The fundamentals should never be neglected, and it was nice playing around with them with a more experienced touch. Inverting her flows without thinking, Taija spun a simple web of spirit into the first letter of her name, visible only to her. Next, she reduced the power going into it, drawing the individual flows out as small and narrow as she was capable of before spinning them together again into the simple web. Now the letter seemed to look the same. But instead of being made of a single, thin flow of spirit, the web was made up of myriad incredibly thin flows woven together. Next was splitting her flows, adding letters to spell out her first name, then her second too. That took focus. Splitting her flows that many ways was one thing. It wasn't like it used much strength. However, maintaining the incredibly fine control she needed to spin infinitesimally small flows together, and inverting them even as she channeled was quite another. Taija allowed the names to fade, and started on another set of webs, this time spinning air and fire together with spirit, keeping her control as fine before. First, she wrote out her own first name again, and then idly started to mix it with another name, making a hot around. She realized what she was doing and released the webs, her vision suddenly blurry. She didn't want to think about that. Melina resisted the urge to sniff as she looked down at Lady Alfreda and cleared her throat again. Light only knew why the Amulin was willing to see her so quickly. The same day that she arrived, in fact. Not that it was the place of an accepted to question the Amulin, of course. First, the woman had just been staring into the distance, as vacant-eyed as a baby, and now she suddenly looked like she was about to burst into tears. It was not any of her business, not if she did not want to be paying a visit to Shiriam's study anyway, but she very doubted the woman was in fact nobility of any kind. Lady Elfreda, the small, blonde woman jumped. Oh, yes. Sorry, I was in a world of my own. That was another oddity. Melina had never heard an accent like that one. Words clipped short, everything sounding like consonants. She certainly did not sound Andoran. Her village must be a true backwater, if she was even telling the truth about where she had come from. Still, she must be at least somewhat familiar with the White Tower. She showed no fear or discomfort at being around Melina, which meant she knew the difference between accepted and Aes Sedai. She carefully moderated her tone. Being rude to guests to the White Tower was, like so many other things, harshly punished. The Amulin will see you now. It was a struggle to keep the surprise out of her voice when she said it. In no time at all Taija was following the snotty accepted through the corridors of the White Tower. She was soon surprised to find herself ascending in some kind of mechanically driven lift. She hadn't thought they had the technology for something like that, but given the height of the tower, they must have. Well, that or thighs of absolute steel. She couldn't really tell under most of their dresses. When they exited the lift, Taija gave herself a mental shake. She needed to get her head back in the game and stop vacillating. It wasn't far from the lift to what must be Siwon's office, down an ornately decorated stone corridor. The large door at the end had the white flame symbol these eyes said I had taken from her own time above it, and as soon as she reached it, the accepted nervously knocked. A barked enter came from within the room, and the accepted pushed the handle down and gestured Taija in. When she stepped through the door, Siwon and Lean were indeed waiting there for her. Thank you, child. Siwon dismissed the accepted with a glance. The girl gave her a deep curtsy and hurriedly exited. Taija quickly imitated her with her own much more awkward and shallow curtsy. It wasn't that bad, though. She'd been practicing. Siwon looked her up and down. It'll do, I suppose, although no one would believe you've ever gone more than 10 leagues from your village before. You could also try to speak more like a noble. She sighed ever so slightly. No matter. The light of Sedar appeared around her, and she spun a web against eavesdropping. Hello to you too, Siwon Sedai, Taija replied. Did my best with limited material to work from. I did choose an isolated place to be from so that I could excuse whatever mistakes I might make. Yes, it would not have been such a bad choice. But why in the light did you say Western Andor? What's wrong with Western Andor? Taija scowled. I know it's isolated. I heard when I was in Keemlin that it's barely even part of Andor anymore, and Andor's the nation I've spent the most time in. I can actually describe parts of its capital. Yes, those would be good points. Except for one thing, have you heard of the Two Rivers? Taija paused to think. Yes, isn't that where Rand and his friends come from? Her brain caught up with her mouth and put two and two together a second later. Ah, exactly. Unfortunately, you are now from the same region as the Dragon Reborn. It seems that if the pattern has a sense of humor, it is a cruel one. Well, there is not much we can do. That net is already torn. Western Andor is a big place, and if we are lucky, no one will make the connection. Definitely. I've certainly never been to the Two Rivers, long way away, barely heard of it. They make cigarettes or something, don't they? Siwyn gave Taija a look that said she wasn't sure if she was being flippant, but she wasn't impressed either way. Fortunately, Lean quickly stepped in before Taija could give an intemperate response. So Taija, said I, we've discussed the best way to work with you, and we think it might be best for you to move into the tower. We will say that you are petitioning for help with a family dispute, and while you wait for a resolution, you will live on tower grounds. So you can keep an eye on me. Taija raised her eyebrows, wishing not for the first time that she could do it with just one at a time, because it will give you relatively free access to the tower and means money will not be a problem. Neither I nor the Amulin has time to waste on watching you in or out of the tower. She softened her words with a smile. Anyway, given your advantages, I doubt it would be much of a constraint for you. All right, makes sense. How about the teaching? At night, we often work late and do not want to be bothered. Siwyn answered this time. I will show you my bedchamber as it connects to my office. If you have seen it, you can travel. She hesitated at the word. Directly to it. Correct. At Taija's nod, she continued. Very good. Come at ninth bell tonight. It took Taija a second to work out what that was. That works. I'll come then. Be careful not to have anyone in your bedchamber at the time. A gateway will cut through anything or anyone it touches. Now, what about your side of our bargain? Siwyn looked irritated. Yes, I have not forgotten. However, I am trying to sail the fingers of the dragon in the dark. The sisters are riled up, and my position is weaker than I would like. Taking an angriel officially is out of the question, and while I have no doubt you could, I am reluctant to have you raid the storerooms that would truly set the silverpike among the baitfish. However, I know of a sister who has been keeping an angriel she should not have. If I cannot obtain you one in another way, I shall have a talk with her. You mean you'll blackmail her? Siwyn didn't blink. Yes, is that a problem? Given everything, not in the slightest. Good. Is there anything else you think we should discuss before tonight? Taija thought for a second. No, that covers it. Will you make arrangements for my rooms? Their meeting quickly came to a close, and she found the accepted waiting outside the door to escort her back down after she gave Mother her best curtsy. Why couldn't these women bow like sensible people? Taija found she quickly fell into a routine in the White Tower, despite the sheer oddity of the place. During the day, she was largely free to roam, at least in the public spaces of the tower. Unfortunately, the Aes Sedai were more than standoffish, sweeping past with barely a glance of acknowledgement as she made herself curtsy to them. At least she'd very quickly realized that was necessary. It was ridiculous, really. Aes Sedai deserved respect, of course, although she wasn't so sure about this time's incarnation of them. However, the subservience, almost fear, that they demanded here was an obscenity. It made a mockery of their title. Any Aes Sedai who'd behaved like that in her time would have been ostracized in the hall. One plus side of being in the White Tower was the library. While Taija didn't have unfettered access to it, even the public sections were enough to keep her occupied for long hours. So, each morning she'd travel from her room to somewhere isolated to train and exercise alone, and then return to the tower to wash before heading to the library. She focused on books covering history and culture. It wasn't like there was anything worth calling science there, and books on the power were restricted. Taija did try to seek out books that touched on the dragon and or Aes Sedai, but again, many of those weren't available to the public. At night, she traveled to Siwyn's rooms to teach her and Lean. That was yet another source of frustration for her. It wasn't that they were bad students as such, but they really did seem to struggle to remember that they were students. This meant frequent clashes as they tried to assert their authority as two of the most powerful women on the planet. Siyun sighed internally as the blasted woman looked at her weave with unimpressed eyes before barking again. At first, she had actually been a bit excited to be learning secrets from the Age of Legends, even with the unending stress that came from problem after problem piling up on her shoulders every day. However, she now felt like a novice being berated for learning slowly. Ironically, that was actually one of the few things she had not been told off for during her years in White. Channeling the threads of spirit and fire for what felt like the 100th time that night, she brought them together and then gave them the sideways twist that inverted them. She knew they had just faded from sight for the other two women in the room. She also knew Taija would not be satisfied. The woman was an enigma, a problem and a solution in one body. If Siyun had had more time, not that she had enough of that for anything, she would have brought her to heel. That woman should be, needed to be, under the tower's protection, and more importantly, its control. If only she could have got her into Novice White. The problems she was already having with the Hall because of Taija were bad enough, but the Light only knew what would happen if she was allowed to keep running loose. It sometimes felt like if she let her out of her sight for a day, there would be a new problem for her to keep track of. They had been talking about the Forsaken on her fourth night in the tower. That was another thing Siyun was still trying to get her head around. That this woman, who didn't look a day over 30, actually knew the Forsaken. Some of them anyway. She gave such dry, academic accounts of them, but watching her expressions, reading between the lines, it was clear she had met most of them and even knew some of them well. She certainly had some kind of personal enmity with Lanfear, the insane cherry on her already mad cake of a story. Again. Siyun wove and tried not to fumble the threads. Taija had just casually mentioned that Asmodean would not be a problem anymore. It made Siyun want to swear like the fisherman's daughter she had been born as. She just dropped it into a lecture like it was nothing. Siyun had put on her best face for intimidating recalcitrant sitters and demanded to know why Taija had not told them before, and she had muttered something about Agena and Balthamel. Then she had blushed and apologized. How could the woman be so powerful and knowledgeable, and so? Again. The weave came together and vanished, Siyun's fastest yet, which got her a grudgingly small nod of approval. The problem was, Siyun just struggled to categorize Taija. She did not look or act like an Aes Sedai. Far too open about her emotions and intentions, mild features, ignorance and simple dress coming together to make her seem more like a novice or freshly raised accepted. Her odd accent and social mistakes did not help either. If Siyun did not know better, she could entirely believe she was the sheltered daughter of some isolated minor lord. So, Siyun's every instinct when dealing with Taija told her to put the woman in her place, assert her position, and take command like she had with so many women over the years. Women who had seemed far harder, older, more experienced than Taija. Frankly, far more frightening women, at least on the surface. However, every time she tried, a core of steel would show itself in the woman. Mild disposition and the sadness that rarely seemed to leave her eyes would vanish in a flash to be replaced with utterly unyielding certainty, a self-confidence that Siyun could fully believe had been earned with nearly 2 centuries of life. And hadn't that been a surprise? That this woman was past middle-aged for an Aes Sedai. Taija could be almost mercurial at times. Switching from relaxed, even naive, absent-mindedness to tense in an instant, or losing her temper at nothings while ignoring something that would have made an enemy for life of some Aes Sedai. Even her manners were a constant challenge. She oscillated wildly from being insanely casual with address, tone, and behavior one minute to demanding utmost formality and respect the next. Siyun had suspicions about some of it. She'd seen similar things in sisters who had spent too long in the Blight, but much of it just baffled her. Again, Siyun wove, and to her irritation Lean's inversion was noticeably faster. You need to focus more on fine control of every flow. Try to feel each individual flow separately as you bring it out. Awareness is key to this. Again. Siyun was used to being the most powerful channeler in the room, wherever that room was, and in the past, before she had been raised to the Amulin seat, She had not been above demonstrating that power on one or two occasions when necessary. That would not be an option here. When she was not thinking consciously about it, she would see Taija as a naive young woman, not at all frightening, and then she would remember. She still occasionally woke up in a cold sweat thinking about that day in Fal Dara. That, if nothing else, would never let her enjoy the illusion that Taija was just a soft youth barely past 30 for long. She and Moiraine had had her shielded, slammed her into a wall, and they'd still lost, not even after a long duel, but just a brutal, instant reversal. Siwan suppressed a shudder with long years of practice. She had spent sleepless nights trying to figure out how on earth Taija had done that. Her best guess was some kind of ward, but how she had had it in place and triggered it, the light only knew. Even if she could work that out, she still had no idea how powerful Taija actually was, and she was going to have to give her an Angreal light helper. Oddly enough, Lean seemed to get on much better with her. Perhaps it was just personality, or that Lean was more used to following Siwan's lead. No matter. She would get that woman under control one way or another. For the tower, for the world, and for the light. One thing that Taija noticed during her time in the tower was Egwene in Navis white and Nynaeve in an accepted dress, bustling around, busy with various menial tasks. She did her best to avoid them, of course. She wasn't really sure how much they were allowed to know, and they'd hardly been particularly friendly to her in the past. She'd always hated awkward conversations, after all. That lasted for her first few weeks in the tower, but then one day, while she was reading, probably her favorite pastime in the tower, particularly given its huge library, Taija noticed Egwene had been working near her. She seemed to be engaged in one of the incessant chores that they subjected novices to in the tower, but watching Taija out of the corner of her eye. It was a waste of time as far as Taija was concerned. Scrubbing floors taught nothing that couldn't be better taught through more productive activities. It wasn't even much use as a punishment. If you wanted to punish someone who wanted to be Aes Sedai, the work should be pointless to make the point that they were serving nobody. Still, Egwene's presence put her a bit on edge. In theory, the girl shouldn't have been able to recognize her, given the illusion she was under and the false name. However, the girls was definitely watching her. Still, she had better things to be doing than worrying about unfriendly youths and the White Tower's training methods. The next day, when Taija was walking from the tower's east gardens towards the tower library, two novices swung out of a side corridor into place beside her. One was Egwene, the other a pretty red-haired girl she didn't recognize. "Lady Elfreda, might we have a moment of your time?" Egwene's tone was sweet and nothing but respectful. Taija mentally sighed. This was deeply unsubtle. "Oh, yes, can I help you, miss?" "It's Egwene." Her smile widened. "I was wondering where you're from. You see, I had heard you were from my area of Andor, and I was wondering if you had news of home." Taija offered a quick prayer to the Creator for patience in dealing with teenagers who thought they were being clever. "Well, it's been a while since I was home. Houndstooth is a long way from here." Then the other novice spoke up. Even Taija could tell her accent was more refined than Egwene's. "Forgive me, my lady, but you do not sound Andoran." "Fine." Taija had had enough. Patience exhausted, she whipped round to face Egwene. "Cut the crap, girl. What exactly is it that you want?" Her voice was a low hiss, and Egwene briefly recoiled before her self-confidence reasserted itself. The two novices glanced at each other. "We want you to teach her." "No." Taija didn't break her stride. "But," Taija cut Egwene off, her voice saccharine sweet. "What would I, a lady from a minor Andoran village, be able to teach someone like you? You should ask the Aes Sedai to help you." Taija was saved from any further conversation by reaching the library. The girls peeled off to whatever they were meant to be doing just before she went in. Perhaps they were nervous about being seen bothering her by one of the White Tower's Aes Sedai. Chapter 23. Teaching and Tedium. Chapter text, chapter Roman 19, Teaching and Tedium. It was a couple of weeks into Taija's stay in the tower when she saw a familiar face sweeping through the corridors, deep in conversation with another Aes Sedai, both wearing red-fringed shawls. Like the novices, accepted, and other non-initiates of the tower, Taija pressed herself against the wall with a still awkward curtsy at her passing, but her eyes still followed the woman as she glided by. It seemed Eleda was back in the tower. That night Taija asked Siwan and Lean about it. Siwon looked irritated at the question, but she still answered. Yes, she has returned from Keemlin. I thought she would never extricate herself from Morgase's palace, and at one point I believe she did turn back, although I do not know why. Still, she is here now, and it seems it is your fault. My fault? Yes, Taija said, your fault. Siwon's tone implied it wasn't the only thing she blamed Taija for. It seems you were less than discreet when you were in Keemlin. I had thought that I could brush off the talk of your presence in Fal Dara as rumors about a sister using an assumed name, but Aleda has other ideas. She gave Taija a sharp look. She has been spreading tales of being assaulted with the power by a young red-headed woman named Taija who was impersonating an Aes Sedai. I would say she is almost obsessive about it and has also been hinting at lost talents. That's not quite how it happened. Taija trailed off. Perhaps she shouldn't have dumped her in the countryside quite like that. Maybe the blight instead. Siwon ignored her. Not only that, but now my judgment has been called into question. I gave the whole my word that I was confident that Taija in Fal Dara was an Aes Sedai, and now my sophistry is coming back to bite me. I'm sorry. Taija offered the apology while trying to work out what sophistry meant. In my defense, she attacked me, and I had no idea where I was or what was going on in the world at that time. Frustrating as it is, I know that. I accept that you could not have known the consequences. Siwon waved off the apology. You were navigating the fingers without a light, but regardless of blame, there are rocks in the water. In this case, well, when a boat has one leak, it is sure to have others. I have no doubt Aleda knows more than she is saying. I am also dealing with problems due to your killing of Liandrin. She kept talking before Taija could protest. Not that you did anything wrong there. However, there are suspicions around her death. I told the whole the truth, that I believe she died as a result of a Darkfriend plot, but that begs more questions. Questions that I cannot answer without giving away more than I wish, and even if the story is believed, it raises doubts about my competency in allowing her to die on a mission I led. Despite my best efforts, the Hall has already voted to send sisters to investigate. She looked tired and settled back into her chair, but at least the mention of Liandrin reminded Taija of something that had been on her mind. Perhaps I can at least help with one problem. I've been thinking about your Darkfriend issue and the Black Adger. It was irritating the way both Siwon and Lean winced at the term. Clearly your organization is compromised. One of the biggest problems we faced in the war was betrayals and traitors, and I know the damage it can do. We would be winning, beating the Shadow back, and then the General would change sides, or the Shadow would know all about our movements, or a barracks would be poisoned. Without traitors, the Shadow would have lost the war very quickly. Siwon started to protest, but Taija didn't let her speak. Liandrin was evidence enough of your problems. Where there's one bad fish, there are always more in the barrel. Her attempt at a fish metaphor got her an unimpressed stare, and she shifted awkwardly on her feet. Anyway, there must be more, and the Forsaken are sniffing around Tar Valon too. I was never involved in spying or counterintelligence, but I do have some skills that might make me good at hunting your Black Adger. No Aes Sedai will see an ignorant young noblewoman as a serious threat to them. I can listen and watch in ways that one of your Aes Sedai can't. Of course, anyone could do that, but I have two big advantages. Taija held up two fingers. One, you know I'm not a Darkfriend. The fact that you haven't brought anyone else to these lessons tells me you can't say that about many, or even any, of your other Aes Sedai. Two, if I make a mistake and they catch me, well, they might find themselves in a worse position than if they'd left me alone. They expect a non-channeler or some weak, unknown Aes Sedai, and instead they get me. Her smile was predatory. There was a long silence, and then Siwon nodded slowly. You make a good argument, Taija said, but how do you plan to find them? Well, that's the harder part, but I can watch and listen. Eavesdropping is much easier when you can invert your webs, and you must have some you're already suspicious of. Oh, yes, and I want the Angreal for my own safety. It's time for you to fulfill your side of our bargain. Siwon's eyes narrowed, but then she shrugged. Very well, a deal is a deal. I will do my best to give it to you as soon as possible. Lean, you know who to go and visit. She turned back to Taija, musing. I am still not sure how you will find them, though. I suppose they must have some way of lying. Taija gave her a flat look. Well, of course they can lie. That's obvious, isn't it? Well, yes, but they must find a way around the three oaths. You mean the oaths you Aes said, I swear. Surely you just break them. If only it were so easy, but we cannot, except it seems the Black Adger. You can't. Why? A horrible thought came to Taija. Oh no, surely they didn't. Of course, I forget how ignorant you are of some things. Siwan ignored Taija's irritation. We swear the three oaths on the oath rod. It is a turangreal that. Taija cut her off, a smooth white rod about 30 centimeters long. Siwan gave her a blank look. About 2 hands long. Siwan nodded at that, and Taija exploded. Are you insane? You're telling me that the whole lot of you are binding yourselves, like murderers or rapists? Anger flashed across Siwan's face. How dare you? Do you even know what you're doing to yourselves? No, of course, you don't, you stupid, ignorant barbarians. Light help, you bumbling around in the ruins of a civilization you can't even understand, fighting over scraps of misunderstood knowledge like they're gold nuggets rather than a kebab shop's leavings. What's next? Do you secretly cut off your toes to become Aes Sedai? Siyun's Aes Sedai composure had reasserted itself by the time Taija finished her rant. I am glad I only understood about half of that. I take it that you do not approve of the oath rod. Perhaps you could share your wisdom with us on why. There was a definite sarcastic tone to Siwan's words, but Taija didn't care. Voluntarily subjecting yourself to binding, you do realize it halves your lifespan. No, of course you don't. It was something we only did to the worst criminals. They'd be given the choice, severing or binding, and some of them even chose severing. I knew there was something about your faces that bothered me, that ageless look. It's how bound criminals look. Taija shook her head in disgust. Light only knows what other turangreal you're misusing to kill yourselves. She was worked up enough that she mostly missed the uncomfortable look Siwan and Lean gave each other before Lean spoke, smoothly refocusing on the binding rod. All right, we understand you are not well inclined towards the oath rod, perhaps a topic for another time, but that does not explain how the Black Adger circumvent their oaths. Taija let out another long-suffering sigh. It's pretty obvious, really. A binding rod can bind you. It can also unbind you. Her mood dropped even further when she saw the surprise on their faces. Surely it's obvious. You have an undercover Adger of dark friends, and you didn't think you could unbind yourselves to lie. She had to work hard to resist the urge to call them idiots again. So, you're saying that with the oath rod you can unswear any oaths, just like that? Yep, easy. I assume your Black Adger must have sworn new oaths since they still look bound, but those can be unsworn too. Get an Aes Sedai in a room, ask her to unswear all her oaths. Taija twisted her mouth in distaste. Get her to reswear your 3 oaths if you must, and then ask her if she is a member of the Black Adger. It took them a few moments to get over their shock, or possibly their cultural inertia, and then Siwan met Taija's eyes, a predatory smile growing across her face. I may not like your tone, but sometimes you remind me of why we are working together. With that, she was all business. Getting discreet access to the oath rod may be difficult, so better to start your observations as soon as possible, and we can discuss possible target. We will have to be careful not to give ourselves away, but once we have the rod, we can start. Siwan looked over at Taija and Lean. We can start with ourselves, unswear all our oaths, and then reswear the 3 oaths before we confirm we are not friends of the dark. Taija nodded along until she realized Siwan had included her in that. Oh, fuck no. Absolutely not. I will not under any circumstances swear on a binding rod, not even with a shock lance to my head. I won't be treated like a criminal to satisfy your backwards rituals. There was a bit more bickering, and it all left Taija in a foul mood with the other 2 women. But eventually, the 3 of them came to an uneasy agreement. Siwan and Lean would obtain the binding rod, then when they were all ready, the first target could be brought to a meeting with them. Taija would be there to provide additional firepower if needed. Amidst the seemingly endless shelves of books in the tower library, Taija became a familiar enough face that she actually went beyond exchanging polite pleasantries with one of the brown sisters that seemed to run the place. Given her white hair, Taija thought Benny must be one of the older Aes Sedai, although like with most of them, she couldn't quite put her finger on how old she was. It made her shake her head every time she thought about it. Way these people crippled themselves and didn't even know it. She was a slender woman, normally wearing a relatively simple dress in muted colors, and she seemed to spend even more time in or around the library than Taija did, although Taija did occasionally see her teaching groups of bored-looking novices. They'd first ended up talking when Benny had heard her muttering in disgust over a book about her own time. "Is something bothering you, my dear?" Taija had looked up and answered without thinking. "It's just ridiculous, some of these descriptions." She was already kicking herself when Benny smiled and nodded. "Oh yes, Barra's works are often of dubious provenance. I think his descriptions of parties in the Hall of the Servants are more lurid figments of his imagination." Taija had shuddered. She'd read that part with horrified fascination. It had sounded like bad erotic fiction. "Well, I'm glad to hear that. History is so fascinating, though I can't help reading as much of it as I can, even when it's this ridiculous." She wasn't even lying much. Benny had smiled and said, "My name is Benny Sedai, and you are." Taija watched the glowing flows of spirit and fire hanging in the air before they slowly faded as Siwan inverted them. With a hiss of frustration, she rounded on Taija. "Why am I doing this again for the 1,000th time? I can do it. Can we move on?" Taija sighed. She'd already had this conversation several times over the last few days, and it was becoming more and more of a struggle to contain her annoyance with the woman. "Yes, you can do it," Siwan said, "but barely. A skilled channeler can invert their webs as they form, channeling undetectably wherever they are. You aren't even close to that, and what it takes is practice. Just because you're strong enough to quickly and easily pick up the basics doesn't mean you can use the power properly. Again." "Fine, but tomorrow night you will teach us to travel." With a resigned look, Taija agreed. Siwan also told her that she'd be passing on Taija's knowledge to two senior Aes Sedai from her former Aja once they'd been tested with the binding rod. Ania and Megan, apparently. Taija thought Megan might be a sitter, but she wasn't sure she'd met either of them. Nevertheless, Siwan assured her that she trusted them, but preferred to keep Taija's presence as a completely secret trump card so she would teach them herself. A few days later, Siwan was still being a frustrating student. So when the two girls in white popped up again, boxing Taija in, it took a real effort of will to resist the urge to let her irritation bubble over. "Can I help you, girls?" This time it was the redhead, the posh one. "Egwene's told me all about you, and we need you to teach us. We want to fight the shadow." Taija looked up to meet her eyes, irritated that she had to. "I've no idea what you're talking about." "I'm just a simple noblewoman from Houndstooth. All hail good Queen Morgase, may she live forever." For some reason, the sarcastic praise for the queen seemed to irritate her, and Egwene hurriedly stepped in. "Come on, Taija, please. They're holding us back here, and I know you can help us. When the—" She lowered her voice to a whisper. "Forsaken are loose, surely you need all the help you can get. The Amulin won't let us do anything." "So you've told your friend here. What is her name, by the way?" "Elaine Trackhand." The redhead said it like she expected it to mean something to Taija. "Yes, Elaine, all about me, have you?" Taija leant in towards Egwene. Unlike Elaine, she was about the same height as Taija, and she quailed under Taija's gaze. "I'm sure I remember Siwan telling you to keep your mouth shut. Do you not understand the importance of keeping secrets? Why on earth would I teach you when you can't even keep the simplest secret?" Taija turned away. "Not that I know how to teach you anyway, being just a simple Andoran noblewoman." She didn't even try to sound like she believed it. With that, Taija turned on her heel and stalked away, but as she did she heard Elaine ask, "Siwan? Who's Siwan? Does she mean the Amulin? She's on first-name terms with her." When Taija started her search for the Black Adger, she quickly realized, or maybe remembered, that she really wasn't cut out for intelligence work. She'd managed to befriend precisely one Aes Sedai, and that was a thoroughly harmless-seeming brown who just wanted to talk about history. Her conversation with others hadn't gotten her very far at all. One thing that was totally clear was that these Aes Sedai were utterly closed off to outsiders. It was ridiculous. How could they call themselves servants of all while they swanned around their tower, which was literally ivory-colored, refusing to acknowledge the existence of the outside world? Taija tried eavesdropping on conversations, but only heard a combination of mundanity and politics. She wasn't interested in hearing Aes Sedai gossip or their machinations. She really couldn't care less who the next sitter for the Red Adger would be. It didn't help that it was relatively difficult to do, given the profusion of wards in the tower and the restrictions on Taija's public movement. She did seriously consider trying to find out what Aleda was doing, But the woman rarely showed herself in publicly accessible areas of the tower, and even when Taija was able to work out where she was always on the move. Taija was also nervous about being too close to her. Of course, there was no way that Aleda would recognize the face she was using, but she was still, hopefully, the only person in the tower who would recognize Taija's accent. Given that Aleda was out of the question for now, after a week of trying to randomly eavesdrop, Taija decided on a different focus. She just didn't know the White Tower's Aes Sedai well enough to pick up on any signs that one of their own might see. However, she did have one big suspicion: the Green Adger. Apparently they called themselves the Battle Adger and were devoted to studying war so that they could fight the forces of the shadow. In her heart, Taija knew she'd be a Brown. However, she'd spent the last few years fighting a war for the very survival of her civilization, following the professed ideals of the Greens, so she should feel a certain kinship. But her mind went back to Fal Dara, the gigantic Trolloc army. Where were the Greens then? How could they claim to be devoted to the fight against Shadowspawn and not even have any members in a major borderland nation, ready to stand with its defenders when an army of Shadowspawn threatened to obliterate the entire nation? It reminded Taija all too much of certain times during the war. When armies failed to move, much-needed channelers didn't arrive, or entire fronts changed sides. Most of the Green Adger were probably well-intentioned, but she strongly suspected it had been heavily infiltrated by the shadow. It was where she'd have started if she was trying to undermine the light. The Greens also seemed to be a bit more human than many of the other Aes Sedai. Less serene composure, more open and direct, which made them at least a little easier to speak to. So Taija started going to the place she most often saw them, the warder training grounds. There was always a gaggle of women, including Aes Sedai, watching the men training with swords or their bare hands. Even Taija could admit, on an intellectual level, that their well-muscled, glistening bodies could have a certain distracting influence. However, if she let her mind wander, the sight of them exchanging rapid blows with practiced swords just pulled her thoughts back towards the gaping hole in her heart. Some memories were simply too painful, so she did her best not to think about them at all. Despite her internal turmoil, Taija fitted right in with the other watchers as a youngish-looking single lady. More importantly, it gave her access to some of the Greens. From there, she was only an earnest question away from making a connection. There was one, named Jarsin, who was a regular that Taija had been exchanging polite greetings with and who she'd thought would be a good first target. But when Taija decided to make her move, the woman had such a tension about her that she changed her plans on the fly. She'd have asked her what was wrong, but it was clear by then that no modern Aes Sedai would appreciate that from an outsider. So Taija smoothly pivoted to another of the Greens, who fortunately was there too. Like Taija, Irian was a small woman, but she could easily be described as beautiful with deep, dark brown hair and eyes and an exquisitely shaped, delicate face. "Good morning, Irian," said I. Taija greeted her. "Oh, good morning, Alfreda." Her eyes didn't leave the practicing men. "A good day to be out, is it not?" Taija agreed, pretending to join her in admiring the men. After a comfortable silence, she spoke again. "Irian," said I, "may I ask a question?" Without waiting for an answer, she continued. "Forgive me, but I don't understand why Aes Sedai need warders. They're no doubt easy on the eye, but surely you can just rain fire on your enemies and don't need a man with a sword." She did her best to sound as earnestly ignorant as possible. Irian laughed, not unkindly. "Oh, Alfreda, you must understand, not every problem can be solved with fireballs. Even an Aes Sedai needs to sleep. Even an Aes Sedai can be overwhelmed. But could you not just—" Taija gestured vaguely. "Make barriers of air or, wards with spirit." That got her a sharper look. "What do you know of wards, child?" Taija winced internally. Oh, it was just something I had read. Water, air, spirit, fire, and earth, right. She smiled innocently, ignoring her irritation at being called child. Irian relaxed a little, but still seemed more suspicious. "Well, yes, child, but we do not normally speak of such things with people who are not initiates of the tower." She looked Taija up and down properly as if seeing her for the first time. "I do not sense the ability in you, child." Of course she didn't. Taija shook her head hurriedly. "Oh no, I always dreamed of being an Aes Sedai, but I was told that I didn't have the ability." "Ah, a pity. Well, while an Aes Sedai can of course fight without her warder, we Greens train to coordinate with our warders, Together we are greater than the sum of our parts. Oh, how fascinating. Taija didn't even have to feign her interest. It really would be interesting to see how the modern Aes Sedai's combat specialists fought, although she suspected she'd be disappointed. Would she be able to do better with Aleski with some practice? Hopefully he was all right. Is there any chance I could see a practice, Irian said. It would be so exciting. Irian gave Taija a cool look, back to Aes Sedai serenity. No child, that would not be possible. We do not allow outsiders to see the weaves we practice. To do so might lose us a key advantage in our fight against the shadow. Taija acquiesced as gracefully as she could. After that conversation, Taija ended up spending much of the rest of the day wondering how Alexei was doing and where he was. If she knew that, she could just go and fetch him, although that might cause Siwon more issues. It didn't matter since she had no idea. Alexei would just have to look after himself. That night, Taija dreamed of her last day in her time. Fire raining down from above, her desperate flight from her attacker and shouting to Entiro. This time there was no stasis box. The town hall collapsed on her, crashing pressure that suddenly vanished as it was thrown away with the power. Battered and unable to channel, she was dragged by a pair of Trollocs to face her attacker. Looking up with terrified eyes at a laughing Ishmael whose eyes and mouth only spewed fire. Taija woke up with a start sweating and desperately flailing at something that wasn't there. Just a nightmare. As the confusion faded, she instinctively reached out beside her in the bed, looking for reassurance and comfort, but he wasn't there either. It took a long while for her to get back to sleep that night. The next night, an irritated Siwon handed Taija a thin gold necklace. Finely formed links came together to form a chain with a pendant surrounding a small emerald. Taija took it, looked it over, and then froze, standing there speechless, just staring at the pendant in her hand. It was in the shape of a dancer's crest, the three-pointed infinitely looping, not symbolizing people, knowledge, and industry, with the circle of unity through them, bringing all three together with unending potential. Taija must have stood there staring for minutes before Siwon asked, "Is there something wrong with it?" With a start, Taija looked up and realized she was having to blink away tears. "Is this what I think it is?" Siwon didn't seem to notice her emotion. "Yes, never let it be said. I do not keep my promises," Taija said. Believe me, I have caused myself no end of problems obtaining this for you. No doubt it will come back to bite me at the worst moment." Taija slid the necklace over her head and pulled her hair over it. It was just long enough that the pendant hung between the tops of her breasts, and when she tucked it under her dress, it was barely noticeable. She reached for Sedar and drew it through the angriel, feeling the power flood through her, far more than she could handle unaided. "Thank you, Siwon," said I. "I appreciate it." Taija's gratitude was genuine, despite her general irritation with the woman, and even if Siwon had no idea how much this particular angriel meant to her. She could feel it was a relatively weak one, but it would still give her a significant and unexpected advantage in a fight. More importantly, it was one last remnant of the city she had grown up in. The third time the girls cornered Taija, she was starting to get quite annoyed, although she could grudgingly admire their persistence. Before they could say a word, she just said, "No," before turning to leave. She paused when Egwene cried out, "Wait!" With a huff of irritation, Taija stopped and turned back to face the girl. "Not here, Lady Elfreda. Meet us at 8th Bell in the lower galleries after dinner." "It's important." Taija forced herself not to roll her eyes at the teenage drama. "Fine, but if you're wasting my time, I'll make you regret it." That night, Taija made her way to the empty lower galleries, keeping a nervous watch around herself. She was fairly sure that Egwene wasn't a dark friend, but not totally, and she really didn't know the Elaine girl. She tried not to let her nervousness show on her face, but the empty columns felt threatening to her, moonlight playing between them, and she was holding as much Sedar as she safely could. "Psst, Taija." She jumped at the hiss and nearly cut a column in half with the power. "What? I'm here." Of course it was the two girls, and she relaxed slightly. "Yes, come along." She was glad to see they looked as nervous as she felt. "Let's go into one of the classrooms so no one can see us." Taija quickly followed them in and found a spot that left her back to a wall. At the same time, she spun a web to ward against eavesdropping and laid it in place around the room. "So you've pulled me away from my evening. What do you want?" Her voice was flat. Elaine piped up first. "We want you to teach us." "I already said no, several times." This time Egwene spoke. Yes, but we can help you. We know you're hunting the Black Adger. She whispered the last two words, and we want to help fight for the light. You're what? 16? 17? Why on earth would I put you in that kind of danger? Because you need us. I know you're some kind of operative for the Amulin, but you're like a fish out of water. You get so many things wrong, no one would ever be fooled by you. Elaine's words felt depressingly true. I'm not saying I am, but if I was an operative for your Amulin, shouldn't you be worried I'd tell her that the two of you've been bothering me, and that you've been spreading word about me, Egwene? I don't think you'd enjoy her reaction. Egwene paled momentarily, then rallied. I don't think you're going to tell her, though, are you? She looked far too confident. I don't know what you are, but I don't really think you work for her. Like Elaine said, you don't quite fit, and you're certainly not respectful enough for that. She had a point. Taija had considered telling Siwyn, but then thought about all the times she had irritated or insulted her and decided fuck her. It wasn't like the girls were doing anything Taija couldn't deal with and Siwyn could do with having her nose tweaked. Perhaps, but all I'm hearing is time wasting. My time specifically. I already said I have nothing to teach you. Elaine jumped in, sounding like she was just musing out loud. You know that questions have been asked about you. At least two Aes Sedai asked if I've heard of a Lady Ulfreda of Houndstooth. Then there's a Lady Sedai. She's got a bit of a bee in her bonnet about a false Aes Sedai named Taija. She thinks she may even have murdered other Aes Sedai. She's been asking about Rand and the two rivers too. Wait, Elaine knew Rand too. And Elada. Egwene smiled, clearly trying to play good cop. Of course we don't believe any of that rubbish, but we really do want to help you if you can help us. Taija wasn't even sure if they were actually trying to be clumsily helpful in a roundabout way or were just trying to blackmail her. It didn't matter. This needed to be nipped in the bud. She put on your friendliest smile. All right, you'd like me to teach you? They both nodded eagerly. Thank you, Taija. I'll teach you a first lesson right now. So, observe. Taija took a breath. First of all, you've both learnt enough that you can see the flows when a woman channels. Correct. Again, they nodded. Good. Taija drew hard on Sedar, inverting webs as she formed them. In half a second, she slammed shields between both girls and Sedar, wrapped them in flows of air, lifting them into the air, and also grasped and lifted every desk in the room. Tell me, do you see anything now? Her tone was conversational. And no, Taija, Elaine replied, sudden nervousness painted across her face. I see nothing. Exactly. Taija's tone went from convivial to razor-sharp. You've both put yourself alone in a room at night with a channeler you don't know anything about and tried to clumsily blackmail her. Egwene gasped. No, Taija. We would nev. Taija cut her off. That's Taija said, I thank you very much. Unlike the sisters here, I don't believe in corporal punishment, but I do believe in proper respect. Now, as I was saying before you so rudely interrupted, you've left yourself completely at my mercy. Do you think there's anything you could do to stop me if I wanted to kill you? Both girls blanched. I could do it right now and leave no trace, observe. Taija moved one of the tables hanging in the air in front of them and directed heavy flows of earth, fire, and spirit into it. Holding so many webs at once would have been a strain if she wasn't drawing through the angriel, but she wanted to make her point very firmly. The table flared briefly into white-hot fire before dissolving into dust, which Taija whisked away with a simple web of air. That could just as easily have been both of you. After another moment of hanging there in the air, Taija allowed them to sink back to the ground and released her webs. Now, what have you learnt from this? Both girls scrambled to answer. Don't have meetings without backups in place. Don't cross you. You're stronger than the Amulin. Trust nobody. That you really do have a lot to teach us. After a minute, Taija stopped them. They really should have been more frightened by that. Where was their sense of self-preservation? That'll do. Fine. I'll teach you. Be here 2 days from now. Same time, same place. It was probably a terrible idea, but she was frustrated with the White Tower. Siwyn pissed her off every time she tried to teach her anything, and the girls would probably just keep bothering her if she didn't. Oh, thank you, Taija, said I. Thank you. The girls started gushing, and again Taija cut them off. Let me be clear. If you want me to teach you, then you follow every order I give you. You don't try to go hunting for the Black Adger. You're too young and they'll kill you without hesitating. You tell no one whatsoever about this, and particularly not the Amulin. Egwene protested. Not the Amulin. At the same time, Elaine demanded, how can you say we're too young? You're at best 10 years older than us. Not the amulin, because if she wanted you to be taught, she'd have told me or had someone teach you. As for my age, Elaine, I'm a lot older than I look. People weren't always foolish enough to inflict bindings on themselves. Eighth bell, 2 days. With that statement, Taija strode out of the room. Chapter 24, The Black Adger. Chapter text, chapter Roman 20. The Black Adger, while Taija couldn't spy on Elada, and she quickly realized that a minor noblewoman was unlikely to get any information out of Aes Sedai, who spent their lives hiding their affiliation from each other. She did have other options. She started to shadow Aes Sedai at a distance in the more public areas of the tower, carefully trailing them with inverted webs of eavesdropping. That had limited success, so Taija started to take bigger risks. She often noticed wards against eavesdropping around rooms and could only assume that was where the truly secret conversations were taking place. Of course, there was no such thing as an unbreakable ward. She could easily demolish them, but the real trick was breaking a ward without the person who spun it realizing. That was why some nights found Taija standing in a corridor, biting her bottom lip with concentration and hoping no one came across her, as she oh so carefully broke through a modern Aes Sedai's best attempts at secrecy. A few nights of spending an hour with the girls before heading over to teach Siwan, and Lean told Taija that they were quick learners, far less obnoxious than the two Aes Sedai too. That being said, the first night Egwene had excitedly told her that she wanted to learn to travel. It hadn't taken Taija long to disabuse her of that notion. Irritating as the two girls were, she had no desire to see them burn themselves out or accidentally spread themselves across several dimensions trying to spin webs they weren't ready to handle. Instead, Taija had spent time going through basic exercises with them. The teaching methods of this time were safe, she had to admit, but both slow and so very crude. There was a fundamental lack of elegance to the webs they produced, small inefficiencies, hand gestures slowing them down. Unimpressive. Can you both make a ball of light? Yes, of course we can. Look, I can make 3. Good. I want you to forget about the ball. First, I want you to focus on making the letter E out of fire in as fine flows as possible. Initially, there was some confusion about Taija's slightly different terminology for channeling. She'd half realized that they called webs weaves now and talked about threads, but really it was quite obvious what she meant. Over the next few nights, she had them repeatedly practicing forming and manipulating the finest flows they could. Her exacting standards always demanded more, better, and quicker. Despite herself, she was a bit impressed at how fast the girls picked things up. Obviously, she could tell they'd never be as strong as she was, but they clearly had a lot of talent nevertheless, and even in her time, would eventually have been among the upper echelons of Aes Sedai on strength alone. It was a tiring life, spending her evenings training the girls, and then Siwan and Lean before getting up early to travel out of the tower to train. Further chunks of time disappeared into eavesdropping on Aes Sedai and trying to speak to as many people as possible. Taija's main source of relaxation was her time spent in the library. Books were reassuringly simple and easy, unlike espionage, and she found she was learning more and more about this time, although she was of course conscious that what was described in a book didn't necessarily correspond with reality. While she was in the library, Taija also found herself spending more and more time chatting with Benny. She was a veritable treasure trove of knowledge and was able to point her to useful texts from memory. She was also just plain nice. Benny seemed to find Taija and her views fascinating too. She'd ask her what she thought of books she'd read, debate with her about historic opinions and events, and just chat about her own life. It seemed that once she'd decided Taija was a friend, or at least interesting, she was far more open than most Aes Sedai. Perhaps she was just lonely. If she was, Taija could certainly sympathize. Benny was also kind enough to find Taija a copy of the Prophecies of the Dragon that was unrestricted, although she didn't hide that fact that she thought it was odd that Taija wanted to read it. The prophecies had clearly gone through multiple translations, and she lacked the context to really understand them, but Taija read them nevertheless. One worrying thing that stuck in her mind was the mention of the dragon reborn being mocked with herons. She remembered Rand showing her the heron burnt into his palm. Probably a coincidence, but Taija did find herself occasionally slipping up and getting odd looks from Benny. There was the time when she absent-mindedly said that that wasn't at all how elections worked in the Hall of the Servants, or the other time when she'd muttered that Akash's laws of momentum were only a useful approximation. In both cases, she'd made excuses about having seen a book in Keemlin, which Benny had gracefully accepted. The biggest slip-up Taija felt she'd made was with the prophecies of the dragon when she asked if there was a copy in the original language, as she was sure some of the translations were off. Benny looked at her strangely and asked how she could speak the old tongue so well. Taija laughed it off as a joke, but it was definitely an awkward moment. Still, despite the hiccups, Taija was very reluctant to miss the cup of tea that she found herself sharing with Benny each day. After 2 or so months of teaching the girls, Taija was surprisingly pleased with their progress. She could see how exhausting their days were, and they often struggled through her additional lessons, but they were determined and pushed themselves past whatever limits they thought they had. After the most basic exercises, she had them combining subtle strands of different elements, forming beautiful patterns visible only to a female channeler. They were already at the point where they could write their names in small flows of any element, and they were getting faster as they went. Taija would never tell Siyun and Lean, but she suspected the girls' fine control was already approaching theirs. It was a wonder what proper teaching and a talented student could do together. She also no longer needed to quell their grumbling about the lessons not being what they wanted. Now they were enthusiastically telling her about how they were progressing even faster in their normal classes and how much the control they were learning was helping them, where before they'd just have put more power into whatever they were trying to do, limiting their progress to the slow rate of growth of their strength in the power. Of course, the extra lessons were helping with their strength too. Taija also found the girls were bringing her information, trying to subtly help with her own hunt for the Black Adger. Of course, they were much less subtle than they thought, and she did her best to discourage them. Anyway, none of it had been especially useful for her hunt, although sometimes it could be useful for other reasons. Taija Sedai. The words spilled out machine gun fast from excitement or worry. Elada was asking me about you again today. She cornered me and wouldn't let me go until Elaine said I had to go to class. Calm down, Egwene. Speak normally and don't shout. Firstly, was she asking about me or Lady Elfreda? Taija suppressed her own worry to present the girl with a calm facade. Sorry, Taija, said I. She was asking about you. Are you not the lady? All right. Well, we know she has a bit of an issue with me, but that's not something for you to worry about. You're not going to tell her anything, are you? No, of course not. But I didn't think she was going to let me go this time. If Elaine hadn't been there, she might have made me talk. Elaine jumped in, her worry for her friend trumped by her desire to defend someone who seemed to have been some kind of family friend. Taija wasn't sure about their relationship, but they were certainly familiar. Elada would not do that. Girls, Taija interrupted before they could start to squabble. I'm sure Elada wouldn't do anything unpleasant to you, Egwene. She's just worried, and if she did, well, don't worry. She smiled. You're my student now, she'd regretted, briefly. Taija knew she wasn't the most intimidating-looking person out there, but both girls shivered slightly at that. The webs making up a ward against eavesdropping weren't particularly complex, as such things went, but they were relatively fine, draping around whatever they were protecting in colorful drifts, at least to Taija's eyes. Her own flows had to be incredibly precise. Fire, air spun around a tiny core of spirit in threads barely visible to the naked eye. She brushed them carefully across the ward. It was a delicate balance between feeling it out for weaknesses and pushing slightly too hard and warning the Aes Sedai inside that something was attacking their ward. Taija had grumbled about the crude way modern Aes Sedai channeled. Lack of proper training meaning they replaced finesse with power, but at least here it was to her advantage. It would be infinitely harder to do this against a ward she'd spun. Actually, it might make a good training exercise for the girls at some point. When Taija's probe found one of the tiny imperfections in the web that made up the ward, she gently started to slide it in. Achingly, slowly, and precisely, the slightest twitch or loss of control would disrupt the ward enough to alert the Aes Sedai within. Taija knew, well had known, people who could have done it in seconds, but it took her nearly half a minute of tense focus before the conversation inside sprung to life in her ears. The first time she did it, it had just seemed to be gossip. Nevertheless, she'd listened, and found out far too much about someone named Alana's sex life. How did she have time for it all if nothing else? The second time Taija had heard politics, some dispute between faraway lords. The third time had been the same. Much of what she heard was interesting, but nothing that could point her to signs of the Black Adger. Over the weeks, Taija did make note of some interesting tidbits, though, ones that might lead to something worth more investigation. She heard a green she thought was named Asni speaking with someone she didn't recognize about taking a package to Falmy and needing to arrange horses. She'd have dismissed it, but they also mentioned Lyandrin in passing. The only Aes Sedai she knew for a fact was black. Another night, she heard a conversation between two Greens, Kerrion and Eliza. Elsa. These two seemed to turn to the subject of the dragon reborn. They didn't mention Rand, but they spoke in careful terms about how, when he was found, he would have to be turned. It certainly seemed suspicious. However, modern Aes Sedai did seem to have an obsession with forcing everyone towards their way of thinking. It was the third interesting conversation that caused the most trouble. That night, Taija failed to find any Green sisters to spy on, but took the opportunity to eavesdrop on a pair of Reds instead. While she was unimpressed by the Greens and suspicious of them, she really struggled with members of the Red Adger. They seemed the most haughty and dissociated of the Aes Sedai, and she'd heard them say some genuinely unpleasant things during her eavesdropping. While it wasn't evidence of them being dark friends, given this time's bigotry against male channelers, it didn't leave her feeling well disposed towards them. Taija found herself listening to Javindra Dorel, who she thought was a sitter for the Red Adger, and Duhara B, she couldn't remember, didn't really care either. I tell you, the woman is losing her grip. She has never been the best choice for her position, but recently, I fail to see what you are suggesting. Aleda's rantings are neither here nor there. The woman has always been one to see conspiracies where there are none. Taija leant forward slightly, straining to hear more. Come on now, you cannot be telling me there is nothing to it. She is attacked by some wilder claiming to be an Aes Sedai. Lyandrin dead in Fal Dara, and then the Amulin assuring the Hall about this Taija. Taija jerked at hearing her name, and her flow flexed. Only a minute movement, but it was enough. Wait, someone is listening. She heard rapid movement towards the door. Fuck. She immediately released her eavesdropping web and stepped back against the wall as quietly as possible before quickly spinning an inverted web to make herself as close to invisible as possible. The two Aes Sedai looked at each other before stalking carefully down the corridor, looking left and right, the light of Sedar around both of them. As Javindra's eyes passed unseeing over Taija, she silently relaxed a touch. After a minute, they came back together outside the room. Nobody. No, I saw and heard nothing. Perhaps you imagined it. No, I know what it feels like when someone probes a ward you're holding. Be ready, I will try something. Javindra gestured with her hand, and a wall of air blasted down the dim corridor towards Taija. She briefly considered letting it hit her, but it would reveal her position either way, so just before it touched her, she lashed out with a sharp web of spirit and fire. Javindra squawked as the flows snapped back into her, and Taija was already moving, letting the illusion around her dissipate and rapidly spinning several webs. Who? Dohara barely had time to start speaking before Taija slammed a shield between her and the power and tied her up in air. She never even had time to realize she was in a fight. Javindra was a bit more on the ball, and fire briefly speared from her outstretched fingers towards Taija before she swept her feet from under her, caught her on a cushion of air, and shielded her in one smooth combination. It was lucky both of them were relatively weak, even by the standards of this time's Aes Sedai. Unfortunately, Taija now had to decide what to do with them. She doubted they recognized Lady Elfreda, but she also had no doubt they'd be able to find her if she let them go. They'd seen her assumed face now after all. Oh well. It seemed they'd just volunteered to be the first involuntary test subjects for her Black Adger cleanup program. No one seemed to have heard the sound of the brief confrontation. At least she couldn't hear any shouts or running feet, so she had a few seconds to think, but she couldn't stay there in a corridor with a pair of trussed-up Aes Sedai for long. They were both squirming in their barns of air, furiously bulging eyes staring at Taija. Fine, it was going to be embarrassing, but she was going to have to make this Siyun's problem. Quick webs of earth and spirit, carefully spun around the captive Aes Sedai's eyes and ears, ensured they wouldn't see or hear anything they weren't meant to. A thought brought a gateway through to Taija's own room, inverted obviously, and she gently floated the women through. For now they were only suspects, and it would be wrong to make them any more uncomfortable than she had to. A quick twist tied off the webs on them, and with them safely stowed on her bed, Taija spun another gateway to Siwon's bedroom. A few minutes of explanation, and Taija had a very grumpy Amulin, still in her bed clothes, sitting in her office when she brought the two red sisters through another gateway. Taija placed them in front of Siwon and moved behind them so that they couldn't see her. Then at a gesture from Siwon, she removed the block from their eyes and ears. Blinking in the sudden light, they both looked up at the Amulin's stern face. "Mother," gasped Javindra, "what is the meaning of this? Have you stooped to kidnapping sitters in the corridors of the tower? When the Hall hears of this, they will." Siwon cut her off with a look. Taija was somewhat impressed at how intimidating she could actually be. It was surprising she'd never tried to use that look on her. "The Hall will not be hearing about any of this, daughter. For now, at least." Her voice hardened further. "Do you know what you have nearly done? Interrupted one of the most important operations the tower has undertaken with your blundering. I am minded to order you to do penance for the next decade. How dare you? I have been assaulted, and instead of searching for the perpetrator, you sit there threatening me. What kind of operation would justify that?" Rather than speaking, Siwon channeled, and a flow of air plucked the binding rod off her desk and floated it to her hand. Both Aes Sedai went quiet at the sight of it. Siwon channeled a simple flow of spirit into it and then said, "I swear to speak no word that is not true." She paused. "I am not a dark friend. Which of you wants to go first?" Duahara broke her silence. "How dare you? This is the greatest abuse of power by an Amulin since you cannot dare to suggest that either of us is a dark friend. We have sworn the 3 oaths. We are Aes Sedai." Javindra had looked like she might protest, but somehow the vehemence of Duhara's ranting made her change her mind. Instead, she looked sideways at her before looking back at Siwon. "Very well, mother. I will do it, but we will be having words when I have." Siwon nodded. "Of course, daughter." Taija released the air holding Javindra in place and spun another web muffling the frantic rant coming from Duhara at the same time as Siwon floated the binding rod on another flow of air. Without hesitating, her eyes on Duhara, Javindra took hold of the rod, paused for Siwon to channel spirit into it, and repeated the oath. "I swear to speak no word that is not true. I am no dark friend." Siwon stood and smiled, looking down at Duhara, who'd started to thrash wildly against Taija's web of air. "Thank you, Javindra. Welcome to the hunt. It seems that the first fish has already slipped into our net." The rest of the night was a bit of a blur, and Taija knew the 3 of them would be exhausted the next day. Siwon gave Javindra an abbreviated explanation of the Black Adger hunt, brushing over Taija's involvement and sidestepping her questions about her. Taija could tell she was hurrying things along to avoid giving Javindra the opportunity to question her more, with promises to speak further when there was more time. Before Javindra left, she promised Siwon that she understood the seriousness of the situation and would not seek to bring it before the hall. Siwon retreated to her bedroom to summon Megan and Angia, and Duara's shield was quickly transferred to them before she was bundled off to a storeroom somewhere with mutterings about the chair of remorse. Taija decided she didn't want to ask. What she wanted most of all was bed. The next few days were particularly tense for Taija. Siwon cancelled some of her regular training sessions, and when she did have them, both her and Lin seemed worried and exhausted behind their Aes Sedai serenity. When Taija asked about Duhara, she was told that she still refused to reswear her oaths and denied being part of the Black Adger, demanding that they follow Tower law. She could tell that they're getting increasingly unsure about whether Duhara was even black or not. It was on the 5th day that Taija got good news. Duhara had finally broken and agreed to swear on the binding rod. She had to first unswear her existing oaths, as Taija had expected. What was a surprise was Siwon telling her that apparently it was excruciatingly painful to so. Unfortunately, the blacks seemed to use a cell structure, so Duhara could only name 2 other black sisters. Both were social women, so it would be difficult to abduct them without anyone noticing, especially with there already being talk about Duhara's sudden departure from the tower. However, Siwon seemed as happy as Taija had ever seen her, entirely confident that now that they had names they could start to roll up the Black Adger step by step. She also seemed a bit more relaxed around Taija, which was nice, although they still clashed during lessons. Apparently Duhara had sworn a fourth oath to obey Siwin and been ordered to keep everything a secret and help with destroying the Black Adger. Normally, Taija would be disgusted at that, but as a dark friend, Duhara should consider herself lucky that she hadn't been executed out of hand. In fact, Taija offered Siwin a couple of suggestions on additional oaths, including one not to unswear her current ones without Siwin's permission. Despite the good news, Taija was a little worried because that evening, when she'd arrived for her regular lesson with Egwene and Elaine, she found no one there. She'd waited with increasing irritation, but they hadn't come. The next day, Taija kept an eye out for them, but saw no sign of them, and again, there was no one there for the lesson in the evening. On the third day, she took the opportunity to ask after Egwene at her regular training session with Siwin and Lean. The idiot girl has run away, not just her, but Nynaeve and the daughter heir of Andor too. The daughter heir? Do you mean Elaine? That got Taija a sharp look. And how exactly are you on first-name terms with her? Siwin made a frustrated sound. No, do not say anything. It does not matter, and I do not want to know. I should expect it around you. I have bigger problems. The three most powerful initiates we have seen for centuries, and they have gone. If Morghese finds out before we hunt them down, she's going to cause no end of problems for me in the tower. When I get them back, they are going to only wish they were dead. Taija tuned her out as she launched into a fish metaphor. Taija didn't think it was very likely that they both ran away. Nava's life was clearly hard work, and they certainly felt it, but they didn't seem unhappy. She couldn't see why Nynaeve would go either, although she didn't really know her. While she didn't say anything to Siwin, Taija started mulling it over in bed that night. Why would the three strongest students at the White Tower just up and run? It was a very convenient story, and she'd heard that novices sometimes did run away, but here they had no reason to, and Taija actually felt she knew two of them well enough to have some idea of how they were feeling. It was all deeply suspicious. Powerful channelers, associated with Siwin political consequences for the Tower. Chapter 25. Interlude Roman 4. The Competent Forsaken Subcommittee Roman 2. Chapter text Interlude Roman 4. The Competent Forsaken Subcommittee Roman 2. The three figures faded into existence within seconds of each other. A moment later there was a flicker, and the dark, empty space was replaced with a horde of lush greenery. Birds chirped amidst the fronds of tropical trees, and the buzz of insects permeated the background. Instead of standing on platforms in empty space, the three were now sitting on comfortable armchairs, incongruous in the midst of the greenery. Demandred surveyed the scene with a certain sense of satisfaction. Well, that's a bit more convivial than last time. So, Messana, Semirage, what updates do you have? Semirage rolled her eyes at the surroundings and leaned back in her chair. My plans continue. At the moment the focus is on the return. It is already bringing chaos to the west of the main continent, and if we can stoke the flames successfully, then a full-scale war will serve the Great Lord well. Whichever side wins, the shadow will be stronger. Messana, on the other hand, seemed more irritated than bored. There's something going on in the tower. I haven't quite gotten to the bottom of it yet, but I'm sure that the Amulin is up to something. She's a hard woman, but normally not particularly subtle, so this is a change. Of course, I'll be able to deal with whatever she's come up with in due course, but there may be some instability in the tower soon. What about you, Demandred? Everything is going smoothly and according to plan for me. Soon I'll be exactly where I need to be. I've got a couple of irons in the fire in the Central Nations too, but nothing that should concern either of your interests. Excellent, Semirage nodded. So what about the others? Any news of their movements? Messana frowned. I'm not sure it's news as such, but Asmodean has vanished. One day he was in Tar Valon going around doing his silly little shows. The next, nothing. Well, that is interesting. Demandred sat up a bit straighter. I'd expect Maghedian or Lanfear to just disappear on some scheme, but Asmodean was always a bit too obvious for anything like that. Semirage shook her head in disagreement. I look down on him as much as any of you, but we should remember even if he is the least of us, he is still one of the chosen. Look at Agner and Balthimel. They went off to face a farm and a half-drained girl. hardly comparable to any of us, and now they're both dead because they underestimated them. Messana, do you think maybe Asmodean might have something to do with the difficulties in the tower? Perhaps he found what he wanted and is now acting against you there. I confess that hadn't occurred to me. A worrying thought. The so-called Aes Sedai of this age are a trivial concern, but one of the chosen, even Asmodean, is much more significant. She looked up, lost in thought for a moment. Well, thank you for the idea. I'll look into it, and if that is what he's doing, then I'll have to re-educate him. Messana's smile was more feral than friendly. There was a brief silence until Semirage spoke up. Ishmael has moved himself to Falme, where he seems to be spending time with the return. At least that will mean less interference in the Empire itself. Last time I spoke to him, he said he was waiting for the girls and smiled enigmatically. Messana huffed irritatedly. Well, I think that explains one thing. The tower's been awash with stories about 3 students running away. 2 of them are from Luz Thurin's village, and all 3 are among the most powerful students they've had in centuries. Not that that's saying much. I wonder if they're what Ishmael's excited about. She continued with an annoyed grimace. If it wasn't Ishmael, we'd be having a thorough conversation about why he should stay out of my territory. I had plans for those girls. With proper training, they wouldn't have been insignificant. But since it is Ishmael, she trailed off to nods of understanding from the other 2. Semirage nod even had a tiny hint of sympathy in it. Believe me, I know how irritating that man treading on your toes can be. If I could get him out of Falme, I would. Still, it is a relief that he's got proper reasons for grabbing them. With his cackling about girls, I was starting to worry he might be turning into another Ravin. Not that I care what he does with the girls, you understand, but he just goes on about them so much. That brought a look of exasperation to Demandrid's face. Speaking of Ravin, he set himself up in Andor. It seems he's moved into the royal palace and is enjoying the queen's company, along with any other woman who comes near him. Messana rolled her eyes. Well, of course Ravin chose that way to contribute. The great lord only knows how that man managed to become one of us. Is he even doing anything useful beyond banging whatever noblewomen catch his eye? She didn't wait for an answer, shaking her head. Of course he's not. Actually, Demandrid replied, I think he may be plotting something with Samel. He held up a hand to stop their immediate denials. I know, but Samel has definitely been visiting Keemlin. But Samel hates Ravin nearly as much as he hates Luz Thurin, protested Messana. Demandrid shrugged, even as his lips twisted downward at the mention of the dragon. That is true, but much as we all despise Ravin, we have all put up with worse when it would benefit us. I do not think we can discount it. I will keep an eye on the situation, and if Samel can actually put up with that man's idiotic preaching for more than a few minutes, then so be it. We will find out what they are up to. Semirage gave her own shrug. Well, I cannot argue with that. Have either of you spoken with Beryl recently? When both shook their heads, she continued, well, you are not missing out on much of interest. He seems to be incapable of talking about anything other than how he is locking down the greatest fortification of the age. The inverted commas were audible in her tone, and preparing an ambush, ready for the prophecies. He is just refusing to even talk about anything else, and when I tried to discuss coordination of the Great Lord's plans, he kept asking me how I thought a Cinchen army might try to take the stone. I suppose he always did like playing with soldiers. No offense meant Demandrid. Demandrid waved her off. Bell's one-track mind aside. Any other updates? One more from me, said Messana. Lanfear seems to have cheered up a bit, much less of a temper on her than last time I spoke to her, so presumably something's going right for her, but I've no idea what. Semirage looked annoyed at that. What about Maghedian? Do either of you know where she has been crawling around recently? No one ever knows where Maghedian is until she wants them to. Demandrid didn't look pleased at the fact, but neither of the other 2 could disagree. Conversation trailed off after that, and the 3 soon departed, leaving the lush gardens to fade back into blackness. Chapter 26. A Break from the White Tower. Chapter text, Chapter Roman 21. A break from the White Tower. Taija's feeling of satisfaction at successfully catching a member of the Black Adger, even if it was more a matter of lucky incompetence than skill, was quickly replaced by her increasing worry about the girls. Siwon seemed relatively unconcerned. informing her that if she had actionable intelligence, then there was something to be done. But until then, she had too many fish already in the pot to be worrying about finding more. The fish metaphor didn't improve Taija's mood. The amount of investigating Taija could do by herself was limited, though. She was tempted to drop her disguise and start bashing Aes Sedai heads together and demanding answers, but that wasn't a realistic option. Instead, she had to settle for being the Lady Ilfreda, concerned about a pair of novices who had been kind to her. Her feeling of dread about the girls strengthened as no one she spoke to seemed to have any idea where they'd gone. 3 inexperienced girls couldn't simply disappear that easily, not without discovering how to travel, and Taija definitely hadn't taught that to them. Although when she found them it might be a good idea to. Taija was worried that she'd attract unwanted attention with her questions, but at the same time, she was increasingly driven to the point that she just didn't care. Really, she was turning into a ball of frustrated tension in the White Tower. She was deeply outside her comfort zone, trying to work out what was going on with its manipulative women, and all the time she could feel an itch between her shoulder blades. At some point, she was going to accidentally give herself away, if she hadn't already, and then it would only be a matter of time until someone tried to put a knife between them. This all came together to make Taija increasingly irritable, and more than once she found that her and Siwon were sniping at each other, with Lean having to act as peacemaker. The only source of relief for Taija was her regular chats with Benny. She was just so nice, particularly for an Aes Sedai. "You know, Alfreda, I think you're worrying too much." Benny looked at her with hooded eyes over her cup of tea as she took a sip. "Every time I see you, you look tenser." Taija sighed. "I know, Benny, I just worry about home." It wasn't even a lie. Taija tried not to think about home. Everything that had happened to it, the war, the people she loved. "I hope the Amulin will be able to help." She trailed off a little lamely. Benny smiled and put her hand on Taija's. "I've no doubt that in the long run things will turn out better for you. The wheel weaves as the wheel wills, but you're a talented young woman, my dear, and things will sort themselves out sooner or later." Taija offered her a weak smile and changed the subject. "So I've been reading about the Trolloc Wars. It was a week after Duhara's surrender that Siwon told Taija that she was making the next move in the hunt for the Black Adger. Elsa Penfell, a green, Taija noted with satisfaction, had been identified by Duhara as one of them, and Siwon was ready to take her. That night, Siwon had Taija waiting in her bedchamber, under various inverted weaves to conceal her, when Anya and Megan dragged the Black Sister through a gateway bound in weaves of air. Siwon didn't want Taija to be known to anyone that she didn't have to be. As she said, if 2 people know a secret, it is no longer a secret. Actually, Taija was a little surprised she didn't manage to bring fish into the saying. As with Duhara, Elsa frantically refused to swear the oaths, feigning outrage to cover her fear, and so she was taken away. A very uneventful night for Taija in the end. The next week Siwon was ready to move again. This time the Black Sister was Dagdara Finchi. Taija had never heard of her, but Siwon told her that she was a yellow and noticeably stronger than the others that had been taken. Nevertheless, she was quickly secured and taken away to face whatever Anya and Magian were inflicting on the captured Black Sisters. Taija sat back and sighed as the warmth of the tea suffused her. "I just don't think that that's a plausible way for Aes Sedai to have organized themselves in the Age of Legends." She still couldn't entirely suppress a little twitch at calling it that. The title just didn't mean the same thing then as it does now. Of course it was important, but just not as all-defining, or so I've read. She trailed off a bit awkwardly. She tried to avoid talking about her time, but it seemed to fascinate Benny more than any other subject, and Taija often found the conversation ending up there despite her best efforts. Benny's eyebrows rose. "You do have such fascinating ideas sometimes, Alfreda dear. One day I will have to leave the tower again and have you take me to some of these libraries you have visited. Nevertheless, I think the sources are clear. The ancient Aes Sedai had difficult tests of channeling strength and willpower, I suspect administered through Turangril, which meant that only the very strongest and most talented could call themselves Aes Sedai." Taija scowled at her lap, desperately wanting to tell Benny how wrong she was. "I'm sure you're right," she offered through gritted teeth. So how do the Aes Sedai decide who gets the title now? I've never seen that in a book. She supposed she could just ask Siwan, but since the conversation about the use of the binding rod, both of them had been reluctant to discuss anything like that. Something flashed momentarily across Benny's face, and then she was back to her relaxed, smiling self. Well, Alfreda, you wouldn't have read anything because it's something of a secret. Perhaps that is more of a guideline, though. She laughed sweetly. If you promise not to tell anyone. Taija leant forward and nodded eagerly. Yes, of course, I promise. Well, I will not give you the full details. Those truly are secrets of the tower. However, she paused dramatically. Like in the Age of Legends, initiates must take a test with a Turangreal to be raised to the shawl, also to become accepted, although no one knows whether there was an equivalent position in the Age of Legends. There wasn't, Taija muttered under her breath. These tests use the Turangreal to test their courage, dedication, composure, and skill, to make sure they are worthy of wearing the shawl. Turangreal, she didn't have to feign widening her eyes. Isn't that dangerous? Benny nodded sadly. It can be, but to be Aes Sedai is to understand danger in yourself, to have faced your fears and chosen the path we walk on. All Taija could do was think with horror about what kind of idiotic misuse of a Turangreal these so-called Aes Sedai were forcing on women barely out of childhood. It took another week for Elsa to break, and one of the Black Adger members she named was Asni. With a sinking feeling, Taija remembered the overheard conversation about taking a package to Falme and started making connections in her head. A few questions of stable hands quickly told her that, in fact, Asni had secured a number of horses around the time the girls disappeared. Fuck. Taija resisted the urge to spin a gateway there, and head straight for Falme. She couldn't afford to go on a wild goose chase. She knew she was at risk of jumping to conclusions because of her frustration, and the last thing the girls, or even Siwan needed was for her to go herring off after some red herring. That night, Taija brought up her discoveries with Siwan, who seemed vaguely interested, but told her that she didn't have enough evidence to go on. Siwan would deal with Asni in due course, but there were other priorities. Stronger, more senior Aes Sedai who were Black Adger. She now had the names of sitters. On one level, Taija knew Siwan was right, but on another, she couldn't stand it. Still, it took her another couple of days of haunting the tower in an increasingly foul mood before she cracked in the face of Siwan's indifference. No, that was unfair. In the face of her other priorities. Taija wasn't an immature child. She could understand that Siwan's absolute priority was protecting the tower and rooting out the Black Adger infestation within it. For her, preserving the tower was the most important thing. Taija could see that that was important, of course. However, she could also see that the White Tower was a tottering edifice, riddled with dark friends and women more interested in their own power than in living up to their title. Something to be supported and repaired, probably, maybe, but not the be-all and end-all that the modern Aes Sedai thought it was. Taija had her own priorities. Nynaeve was old enough to look after herself, and Taija didn't particularly know her anyway. However, Egwene and Elaine were children, whatever illusions they might have about their maturity. More importantly, they were also her students, so she had a responsibility to them. Anyway, given what she'd seen of the state of this time's Aes Sedai, 3 channelers with the girl's potential might be almost as important as keeping the tower together. A couple of days of scouting told Taija where Asni's rooms were. As it turned out, it was surprisingly easy to walk around the Aes Sedai's floors when she could look like a servant. The trick, she quickly found, was just to look like she was moving with purpose and to be carrying something mundane like towels. If Siwan didn't want to take any action, then Taija could take her own. Late, the next night, Taija headed for Asni's rooms, carrying an empty jug in her arms for cover. A quick look down the corridor told her the coast was clear, but to make sure she spun an inverted ward against eavesdropping around the corridor outside the room, tying it off to dissipate after a few minutes. Job done. It was time to move. A web of earth, spirit, and air rotated the lock in Asni's door, and at the same time Taija slashed straight through the Black Sisters' wards. A warning squawk blared as the wards collapsed, but anyone nearby would have heard nothing. Taija felt Asni embracing Sedar as she threw the door open. Her strength was insignificant. It wasn't even a fight. Taija slammed a shield between Asni and the power before immediately silencing her protests with a web of air across her face. Another 2 webs blocked her vision and hearing. Scant seconds after she'd started, Taija was in Siwon's bedchamber with a silently struggling Asni. Siwon, as she'd expected, was unamused at being woken up again, particularly when she saw Asni. Her eyes narrowed as she stared at Taija with unconcealed irritation in her tone. I specifically told you that we would deal with Asni in due course. Do you realize how many different problems I am trying to juggle at the moment? You are only adding to them. If the blacks find out what we are doing, then we will be straight into the pot, and you risk giving it all away. Taija shrugged. Her irritation at the tower in general and Siwon in particular was making her unreasonable, and she knew it, but she couldn't bring herself to care all that much. I accept that it's difficult, but I think it's more vital that we recover the 3 most powerful channelers in the tower from the shadow. You can't tell me it's not important. It is important. Siwon stood up from the bed, using her height advantage to look down at Taija. But I can also tell you I have 100 other fish to catch, each just as important, and you lack evidence. Her involvement is just conjecture. Siwon raised her voice, snapping at Taija. I am trying to save the tower, and your disobedience makes every step more difficult, every problem worse. Taija didn't flinch from Siwon's voice or her hard stare. I hadn't been aware that I took orders from you, Siwon. She knew it was childish of her, but she gestured at Asni. If you prefer, I can put her back in her room. Siwon looked like she wanted to put her face into her palms, but after a deep breath she just nodded. Fine. I will summon Angia, and we will work on Asni here. She shot the woman a look of disgust. However, this situation cannot continue. I cannot sail a ship in a storm when the crew are pulling every direction. We must talk soon, but tonight I need sleep. Thank you, Siwon, said I. Taija replied, somewhat mollified by her acquiescence. There was no point in further aggravating her when she had what she wanted. Before long, a sleepy Angia was gumpily taking over Asni's shield and carting her off to what Taija assumed was yet another storeroom. She slept better for what was left of the night. The next morning, after her daily training session out in the country, Taija emerged from her room into chaos. Close-lipped Aes Sedai and warders were hustling around with unknown purpose. Guards stomped from place to place, and novices, and accepted fluttered urgently around. However, no one would tell her what was going on, and in the end she was ordered back to her room by an irritated-looking Red Sister. That night Siwon and Lean were absent for their training, and Taija ended up retreating grumpily back to her room after waiting in Siwon's bedroom a while. However, the next night she was there, and she was absolutely furious. Sisters and warders dead, Turangreel stolen, the Black Adger revealing itself like this. She rounded on Taija. If I find your actions have triggered this, I will. With a visible effort, she brought herself under control. What happened? Taija chose to ignore her unspoken threat. The tower's been in chaos, and no one will even give me a hint of what's happened. Siwon somehow looked older that night, despite her ageless, bound face, and she sighed as she sunk into her chair. 13 sisters have disappeared together. Before doing that, they raided the Turangreel storerooms and tried to steal Angreal too. Thank the light they did not succeed in that, at least. They left 2 dead sisters and their warders in their wake, along with a number of the tower guard. Now I have to work out how to explain this to the hall. Light, help us if this is a sign the Black Adger knows they are being hunted. Taija's stomach sunk as her explanation went on. Not only that, but at least 2 of the women we were going to take next have left with that group. Siwon looked straight at her. I assume you know the significance of 13 women. Taija nodded with a wince. And the Turangreel they took, what are they? Siwon shook her head. It is a bit of a mystery. They seem to have ignored ones I would think were more useful, and have instead taken an odd array that appear to have something to do with dreaming. Also one where the only records that could be found said it produced balefire. She looked thoughtful for a second. Actually, do you know much of balefire? It is forbidden by tower law, but I confess I do not know much more than that. We have lost much. Taija knew that admission pained her. Mind racing, Taija offered her most innocent shrug and tried to divert the conversation. There was no way she was teaching any of these women how to spin balefire. Not really, I'm afraid. Perhaps something from after my time. Maybe the others, though. Dreaming. Do you mean the unseen world? Siyun's look sharpened. I believe so. What do you know of it? Taija breathed an internal sigh of relief at the successful diversion away from balefire. Some things, not as much as an expert, but certainly the basics. The unseen world is a kind of mirror to our world. Everyone enters it occasionally in their sleep, but dreamwalkers can consciously enter it and control it. But do you know how to enter it? Can you stop those women from doing whatever it is they want there? Taija recoiled. No. After a second, she continued more calmly. I'm no dreamwalker. Like I said, I know the basics, but the unseen world is no more accessible to me than it is to you. That was a half-truth, but Siyun didn't need to know that. It's an exceptionally dangerous place. I know people who have never woken up after going there, others who have returned as mindless shells. It's not a place I would go to by choice, even if I could. The thought made her shiver. There were worse places to die than the real world. Fine, there is nothing to be done about that then. Taija hesitated and then offered, Do you know which way they went? Presumably they don't know how to travel. It would be relatively easy to follow them, and Siyun shook her head. No, I would not send even you against 13 of us at once. Taija scowled at that, as if she'd be stupid enough to go head-to-head with them. She'd pick them off from a distance, one by one. Travel in, strike, travel out. But regardless, they used the waygate in Tar Valon to escape. Unless you also have some way of tracking them through the ways they are gone. She looked a little hopeful at the idea. Taija deflated. No, the ways were built after the war, so I probably know less about them you do. The next few days saw little interaction with Siyun. Taija went to their regular meetings, talked briefly, and then Siyun would say she was too busy to do any training. At least it meant she got more sleep. Each night Taija also asked her about Asni, and each night Siyun told her she was still holding out. Taija carefully poured the tea into Benny's cup and then her own. She wasn't sure it was a good idea to ask, but she hated being ignorant. Loyal hadn't really known all that much on the topic. Benny, what do you know about the ways? I heard there's a waygate in Tar Valon. That got her a sharp look, Benny's characteristically absent-minded gaze gone for a second. Goodness me, what in the light brought on a question like that, Alfreda? Taija did her best to look embarrassed. I just heard things, and I was wondering. I've heard of the ways, how they were built for the Argia by the male Aes Sedai, but I don't really know much more about them. Benny shook her head, now looking amused if anything. You really are a sponge for new information, my dear. I must say you probably know as much as most Aes Sedai already, but let me see what I can think of. She thought for a minute, before launching into a detailed description of what a waygate looked like, along with a blood-curdling warning about the dangers of the Black Wind. Fascinating, Taija murmured, comparing it to what Loyal told her months ago in the Borderlands. Yes, it is, but I hope you're not thinking of anything so foolish and going and trying to explore them yourself. Taija shook her head vigorously. No, absolutely not. You couldn't get me in there at spear point. After all, why bother when she could just travel? On the fourth night, after Asni's capture, things changed. When Taija stepped out of her gateway into Siyun's room, the Amulin had a particularly grim set to her body. Ah, Taija, you will be pleased to know that this particular fish has now been skinned. Asni has resworn the oaths and will not be troubling us any more. However, she has also given me disturbing news about the girls. Taija leant forward, practically thrumming with tension as Siyun continued. She did indeed take the girls to Falme. The good news is that they have not been handed over to Shadowspawn or others of the Black Adger. Taija breathed a sigh of relief as her fear for them faded slightly. However, the bad news is very bad. Siyun took a breath. I had been reading reports of problems in the West with rumors of strange invaders and Aes Sedai fighting for them, but it seems the truth is worse than the rumors. There is an invasion going on from across the Arith Ocean, an empire calling itself the Sintian. Taija shrugged, wanting her to get to the point. Are they a big problem? I do not know. We had thought that sailing across the Arith Ocean and surviving was impossible. Even the sea folk do not do it. Well, that's certainly concerning, Taija said in a tone that suggested the opposite. But what about the girls? She struggled to bring herself to care too much about squabbles between this time's nations, although of course any war that weakened the forces of the light was bad. Yes, I am getting to that. So Asni has handed the girls over to the High Lady Suroth of the Sintian. Siwon looked disgusted. It seems they have some kind of device to control channelers. They call them leashed and put a collar on them connected to a bracelet by that leash. Taija spoke slowly, chewing over the concept in her head. How does that even work? She could think of one or two theories, but the idea was both odd and repulsive. Asni said she did not know, just that once the collars are on, there seems to be little one can do. She said Egwene had punched the one holding her leash and instead fallen over in pain herself. Taija's face lost all expression at that. I see, and the other too. More good news. Asni said they escaped, though I do not know whether they are still free. She was clearly afraid of being revealed by them, though. She had planned to join the group that fled the night she was captured. Taija's voice was distant, cold. She was already weighing up how much Siwon really needed her in the tower to fight the Black Adger, debating with herself how much she even cared. Is this Suroth a dark friend too? Apparently so, the second highest ranked person amidst the Sintian in these lands, and a high-ranking dark friend in her own right. I do not know about the others, but Asni believes they are not. Taija realized she was unconsciously clenching her fists, clutching at her dress, and forced herself to relax. Siwon didn't notice, or at least pretended not to. I cannot allow the girls to be kept prisoner by a dark friend like this, but I cannot take action myself. The tower is at a critical point in time, and my other Aes Sedai's absence would be too great a risk. But Taija started to protest. She lifted a hand. You on the other hand, you I can spare. She offered Taija a wan smile, and I think if I said to stay you would agree and then go regardless. You're chafing here in the tower, so go with my blessings. I know we do not always see eye to eye, but believe me, when it comes to dark friend slavers, we are sailing in formation. There was a bit more discussion. Logistics, plans, and more details that Anya and Megan had been able to wring out of Asni. In particular, Taija found that, like the other Black sisters, she used the ways, confirming that the secret of traveling was still being kept. However, it wasn't long before she returned to her room to pack and get a last night of rest in a good bed. Shortly after she woke the next morning, Taija headed for the stables. Anya met her there to hand her a pack of additional clothes and a couple of bulging coin pouches. A brief thank you and goodbye, a check for witnesses, and then she was walking her horse through an inverted gateway onto a skimming platform. Hopefully everything would be easy. Sneak in, grab the girls, and sneak out. Then back to the tower within a couple of days. Chapter 27. Interlude V. The modern world is a lonely place, Roman 2. Chapter text Interlude V. The modern world is a lonely place, Roman 2. The present day, in an abandoned farmhouse near Falmy that night, when Taija went to bed, sleep eluded her, despite her exhaustion, leaving her lying there tossing and turning on her bedroll. Like they did most nights, her thoughts led back to painful memories. With them hovering around the forefront of her mind, she just couldn't find the peace that she needed to fall asleep. A bit more than 3,000 years ago, around 10 years before the end of the collapse and the start of the War of Power. Taija had been out drinking with Entiro one night. It was during better times, before the start of the war, when the world still seemed like a good place, and she could live in blissful freedom. She'd never been a big drinker, but Entiro had an annoying talent for getting her to let loose a little. By that point she was definitely tipsy, although to be fair, not as drunk as he was. Entiro took another gulp of beer and eyed Taija up consideringly over the of his glass. You know, Taija, what you need is a boyfriend. Declaration made, he slammed his now empty glass back down and called the waiter over for another. It was one of the nicest bars in Jalanda. Not the kind of place Taija normally frequented or could even afford, despite being able to live very comfortably on her salary as a full professor. If she was honest with herself, she even felt a little out of place among its glamorous denizens. But Entiro had just bulled his way through whatever objections she raised and dragged her along behind him. I do not need a boyfriend. Taija's tone was as prim as it ever was as she sat back and folded her arms across her chest. You've just been with Sailor for too long, and now you're trying to set up all your friends so you can have some vicarious excitement. She nodded with satisfaction at that argument. Also, I'm far too busy. There, that's my point. Entiro ignored Taija's very good point about just wanting vicarious excitement, of course. You're always too busy for it. Do you really want to spend the next 500 years surrounded by books and cats? Taija pretended to think, stroking an imaginary beard below her chin. Well, it has its appeal. A pause, and then they both burst out laughing. I know for a fact you don't even like cats. He took another gulp of beer to match the sip Taija took from her excessively ornate cocktail. Seriously, though, you're such a sweetheart. It would be a horrendous waste, and I know the perfect guy I want to introduce you to. You'll love him. Taija sighed and rolled her eyes. Not another of your vacuous influencer friends, please. I'd rather the cats than that. No, no, seriously, you'll love him. He's super smart, very motivated, and he's ripped. He leant forward and earnestly put his hand on Taija's. Look, I'm playing a game of airball with him next week. I'll bring Sailor and we can make it a doubles match. No pressure. If you don't like him, you're just doing a favor for a friend. HMPH, you really think I'll like him? You'll love him, on my honor. Fee in, Taija deliberately drew out the word. But if he sucks, you owe me one. Equals. It had been a productive day for Tell. His usual morning routine of plyometrics, fencing, archery, and wrestling dominating. Then a healthy lunch followed by an hour of channeling practice, wrestling the raging torrent of Sedin into complex webs under the direction of his aging tutor. The afternoon brought with it a quick trip to open a new sports complex in his hometown. Forced smiles, glad handing, and autographs were sadly part of the job. Finally, there was the meeting with Antiro, a great agent, but more importantly one of the few people he considered a genuine friend. Opportunities discussed and contracts signed, Antiro persuaded him that it was time for a drink. Tell had been planning a quiet evening at home, but Antiro was disturbingly persuasive. How he managed to combine logic, puppy eyes, and being a huge, middle-aged man with a bushy beard into one giant package, Tell had no idea. Still, that was how he found himself nursing a beer in a quirky little bar halfway across the world. Apparently Antiro had heard about it from a friend, and since Tell could travel, look, Tell, you need to lighten up a bit. Sailor and I both worry about you. I know you're selling the brooding bad boy look, and that's great, but I'm not interested in that right now. Can't spend all your time training and have none for yourself. You need some more fun in your life. Antiro leaned back and waggled his eyebrows. You need to get laid. Tell sighed. For fuck's sake, Antiro, you go on about this every time I see you. Honestly, I'm fine. I have a great life. I love my work, and meeting women is hardly a problem. He couldn't resist a small smirk at that. Antiro was extremely good at looking skeptical. What happened to the last girl? Cleo, wasn't it? I don't want to talk about it. How are things with you and Sailor? Are you trying for a baby yet? Oh, no, you're not changing the subject that easily. Antiro took a swig of beer. Come on, out with it. Fine. Yes, I got bored again. There just wasn't the spark, you know. Sure, she was beautiful and good fun for a bit, but there was no substance. Tell's mouth turned down in displeasure. Anyway, she couldn't channel, so we both knew it wouldn't go anywhere long term, and in the end she left. Something about me not being emotionally engaged. Antiro raised his eyebrows, which to be honest sounds fair enough. I suppose it is. Tell sighed again, slumping in his chair. Same shit, different day. They both sat at companionable silence for a minute before Antiro broke it. All right, well, I've got just the solution for you. A couple of weeks' time, Sailor and are going to be in Jalanda. You know how much they're into airball down there, so we were going to get some games in. Well, that's nice, but what's that got to do with me? Tell had a sneaking suspicion, and he didn't like where it was going. Ah, well, here's the good bit. Antiro leaned forward with a grin. You know how good Sailor is at that blasted game, and she's getting tired of pasting the floor with me. Let's make it a doubles game. There's a girl I know there. Absolute dreamboat, cute as pie, and I want you to meet her. Then I can actually have Sailor on my side for once. Elle looked unimpressed. So what you're saying is that you want me to trek to a different continent so that your wife doesn't beat you in a ball game? Antiro's grin widened. Exactly, and also meet a really cool girl. Nope. I'm far too busy, and we both know how the last date you put me on went. I had to pay a professional to get the stains off the wall. Oh, come on. I know you're not that busy. I'm your agent for light's sake. Anyway, you can travel. It's not like distance is a big deal. Still no. Tell's face was uncompromising. Oh, come on, Tell. She's totally your type and you need some fun. Stop being so serious for once and just let your hair down. Antiro glanced at Tell's very neat, short-cropped hair. Well, leave it unbrushed or something. Anyway, you'll love her. She's got a third name and everything at under 200, super accomplished. You make such a cute power couple. Light, will you stop? The last thing I need is to be in another celebrity power couple, Tell scowled. Okay, look, I worded that wrong. She's a physicist, not at all the celebrity type. To be honest, knowing her, I doubt she's even heard of you. He met Tell's eyes, and his voice took on a wheedling tone. Come on, you'll have fun, meet a hot girl, and I can finally win a game of airball. Tell rolled his eyes. You know what, fine, I'll come. But if you think you're going to win with me on the other side, PFFFF. A dismissive gesture and a swig of beer punctuated the sound. Taija had turned up bang on time, getting off the bus outside the Cam Breet Sports Complex, a huge building that dominated this little part of southern Jalanda. Apparently it had some of the best airball pitches in the city, and despite herself, she was quite excited to give the game a try. The date, on the other hand. It had been a while since she'd found time to go on one, particularly after the disastrous way the last couple had ended. If she was honest with herself, she was more apprehensive than excited about it, especially given Antiro's occasionally odd choices in matchmaking. Sailor was waiting for her outside, looking as glamorous as ever, and they headed to the changing rooms together, catching up as they went. I still don't understand why you take the bus, Taija. It's ridiculous. I know the service is good here, but they take forever and you can travel for light's sake. Sailor immediately restarted on an old debate between the two of them. Taija shrugged with a small smile. It was almost a ritual at this point. I know, but I like them. It's relaxing. I grab a seat on the top deck and I can watch the world go by. But it's such a waste of time. I can't even travel and I don't take the bus. Of course, Sailor was just trying to relax her by getting her onto a pet topic, but Taija appreciated it nonetheless. Sure, but I'm hurrying all the time. It's too easy to just live in your little Aes Sedai or university bubble and just not experience the world. Aes Sedai should be part of the world, not separate from it. Of course, despite Taija's best attempts at avoiding it, the conversation had inevitably turned to her date as Taija pulled her sports shoes on, carefully doing up the laces. Sailor had been watching her get increasingly slow with her preparations before giving her a gentle shove and laughing. Don't worry, Taija, you'll like this one. I'm recommending him too, not just Entiro. He can be a bit awkward when you first meet him, but once he warms up, you'll love him. That was at least a bit of a relief. Sailor had far better taste than Entiro. When the two of them emerged into the warm air outside, Taija immediately spotted Entiro, and standing next to him was the man that was presumably her date. He looked short next to Entiro, but she was fairly sure he was actually a bit above average in height, much taller than her either way. He was wearing a tight white t-shirt and blue board shorts, both filled with toned muscle. His face was framed by neatly cropped, short blonde beard and hair, and he was doing some intriguing stretches. Taija's mental train was derailed when Sailor poked her in the ribs and hissed, "Stop eyeing him up like a piece of meat and come over and say hi." With a jerk, she realized Entiro was waving and quickly hurried after Sailor, already feeling her face heating. Tell was somewhat dreading meeting his date. The creator only knew what she'd be like. Once Entiro got an idea in his head, he was like a dog with a bone. However bad it might be, he wasn't letting it go. Still, at least the game should be fun. He stretched his arms, hands interlinked, enjoying the crack of his knuckles. It wasn't something he had the chance to play very often, but he knew Sailor was an absolute beast in the court, and for all his complaining, Entiro wasn't half bad either. Ah, here they are. Hey. Entiro pointed to the two women and waved enthusiastically. Broken from his musings, Tell stopped warming up and looked over. He immediately recognized Sailor's tall, glamorously blonde form, and Entiro was a lucky man. Walking next to Sailor was a shorter woman in a tight black sports top that left her arms bare and matching shorts. Slim, but probably not tall enough to be called slender, she had light brown skin and straight dark brown hair pulled back into a simple ponytail. Pretty enough, he supposed, but not all that much compared to his usual conquests. If he was honest, he preferred a bit more in the way of curves anyway. Tell, it's so good to see you. Sailor was her usual whirlwind and grabbed him for a hug and kiss on each cheek. You're looking great, still working out occasionally, I see. Laughing at her own joke, she tugged him towards the other woman. Right, I want you to meet Taija. She's going to be joining you in losing to us today." Her grin sparkled. "She's one of our dearest friends, so do make sure you treat her right." Tell didn't miss the undertone of warning in her voice as he offered this Taija his hand and politely introduced himself with his full name. He groaned internally as his big hand engulfed hers, and then her cheeks darkened in a blush, so it was going to be one of those. Despite that her grip wasn't weak. "Taija Kosola Murinen," she replied, looking a little awkward. At least she actually did have a third name, although he supposed he should probably have looked up what she got it for before today. "Pleased to meet you, Taija Kosola. Shall we?" He gestured expansively towards the airball courts. There was a slightly awkward silence as they walked, contrasting with Entiro and Sailor's happy chatter to each other. Tell had never minded silence, but Taija Kosola clearly did. "So Tell Janin, tell me what is it you do?" Antiro never said. He gave her a quick look trying to work out if she was making fun of his name, but her face was a picture of curious innocence. "Well, a few different things these days, but mostly sports. I do a lot of fencing and archery as well as some athletics." To be fair to her, she'd probably been roped into this by Antiro with as little information as he had. The man was a menace when it came to matchmaking. "Oh, really? Is that what you got your third name for?" Tell nodded. 16 years ago now. It was an achievement he was justly proud of. "Wow, you must be very good. I couldn't imagine doing something like that." Tell shot another look at her. Was she being sarcastic? No, she seemed to be completely earnest. He was already getting the impression that Taija was a very earnest person. He supposed it fitted with her being a cloistered scientist. "I do all right, and it's certainly more fun than sitting at a desk all day." She looked a bit put out at that. "Sitting at a desk all day isn't that bad, you know." "Oh, no, no, of course not. I just like being active, you know." Tell quickly tried to change the subject before he put his foot in it again. "What about you? You look very young to have a third name." She shrugged, and her cheeks heated again. "Oh, I was lucky, I suppose, but it was for research. I'm a physicist." This was at least a bit different to most of the women he met, where even the most accomplished were generally celebrities, athletes, or politicians. So he decided to press more. "How interesting. But you don't just get a third name for being lucky. You must have done something impressive." Absent-mindedly, he wondered if she'd known Mirin Iranil before she went off the rails. They'd both been in the same field, although if he remembered correctly, Mirin was a fair bit older. "Oh, it's not very interesting, really." She vaguely waved a hand in the air, very esoteric. "Come on, indulge me. I'm interested." At least Antiro wouldn't be able to claim he hadn't tried. "Well, I found a way to directly observe gravitational waves using the power. You see, before they were largely measured only by their effects." Tell lost track of what she was saying very quickly, but there was something about her enthusiasm, and without realizing it, he found he enjoyed listening to her rambling explanation. Eventually, she trailed off, looking a bit embarrassed. "Sorry, I didn't mean to go off on one." She kept talking over his protest that it was fine. "So have you played airball before? I heard Sailor and Entiro are really good." "Every now and again. I'm not all that great at it." Well, he wasn't compared to the sports he actually got paid to play. But yes, Sailor is disturbingly good. I think she could have gone pro if she'd worked on it. And Tiro moans about how terrible he is, but he's actually pretty good too, just outshined by his better half. "How about you?" "Oh, no, I've never played before." She looked a little awkward and then brightened up again. "But I've read up on the rules and watched a couple of games online, so I should be able to pick it up pretty quickly." Oh, light, he was partnered with a nerd who'd never even played before. They were going to lose so badly it wasn't funny. Still, she did have a nice smile. Taija sensed Tell Janin's irritation when he realized she'd never played before, although he did try to hide it. However, she'd hauled herself away from her desk for the day, and she was determined that she was going to have fun either way. Winning wasn't everything, and at least he was easy on the eyes. They both bumped fists with Entiro and Sailor before moving back to their sides of the court. Like most airball courts, it was a large space with a grass floor, perhaps 70 meters long and 30 wide, with obstacles scattered across it. The ball sat on a plinth in the very center of the court, with the players starting at the far ends in front of their small goals. This time the pitch had a copse of convincing-looking trees to Taija's right, a small lake ahead of her, the usual raised ground blocking the plinth from direct sight of both of the goals, and various small mounts darted around for cover and to provide vantage points. Tel'Janin looked over to her and said, "I'll go for the center and attack. You take the left and defend." "Got it." Despite her initial doubts, by the start of the game Taija was quite excited, rocking up and down on her toes and glancing over at Tel'Janin. He wasn't a very smiley man, but the way his muscles moved as he loosened up his shoulders was quite appealing. Working out occasionally, indeed. It was just a pity he was so grumpy. Taija gave herself a mental slap. She needed to focus on the game. It started with a shout of "Go!" from Entiro, and they were both off. Taija opened herself to Sedar and felt Sailor do the same out of sight behind the ridge lines. Tel'Janin was already moving, an impressively fast sprint taking him into the trees and towards the ball. A moment's hesitation, and Taija was running forward too, scrambling up to the top of one of the mounds to see a cackling Antiro tackle Tel'Janin to the ground, the shaking of a nearby tree suggesting a flow of air gone awry. There was no time to watch them, though. A grinning sailor was running forward, fast and lithe, with her web of air shooting ahead of her to grab the ball and fling it straight towards their goal. Taija wasn't going to lose before the game had even started properly, though. Not on her watch. A flex of her mind and Taija's own web had curled around Sailor's, a subtle twist to disrupt it, and boom. She had the ball, propelling it quickly towards the other end of the pitch. Well, she'd thought she had it, but then with no warning her foot was suddenly yanked out from under her by a web of Sedar, and she hit the ground with a thump, the air driven out of her lungs. As Taija pushed herself up on her elbows, she saw a cheering sailor grab the ball from where it had fallen and charge towards the goal, web of air poised to fend off any channeling from her side. She knew she'd have bruises after this, but nevertheless, Taija sprang back to her feet and chased after Sailor, trying desperately, but futilely to get her own web of air past Sailor's. All to no avail. With a loud bang from the scoring system, Sailor flung the ball through the goal, and the first round went to her and Entiro. With a sigh, rubbing her sore backside, Taija headed back to her goal to meet an irritated-looking Tel'Janin. She could already see he hated losing. Then again, despite her earlier thoughts, Taija was quickly discovering she did too. Tel was not in a good mood. He'd been outplayed by Entiro, the bigger man successfully distracting him with rough and tumble and letting Sailor breeze straight past the weak link on his team. This might be a long day. He could see Taija Kosola wincing a little as she joined him, ready for the second round. It seemed like Sailor hadn't gone easy on her, which was a bit harsh really given how much she outmatched her in both size and skill. Internally he sighed. The poor woman probably wasn't used to this kind of activity. He should at least try to be nice to her. It wasn't her fault Entiro had dragged both of them into this. "Are you all right, Taija Kosola?" He tried his best to sound sympathetic rather than annoyed. "It looks like Sailor did a bit of a number on you. If you want to stop, we can just let her beat up Entiro instead." To his surprise, she scowled at the suggestion that she might want to stop. "No, we're going again." Well, that was a change in attitude, no diffidence in her tone there, just a statement of what was going to happen. He could work with that. As she stretched out, wincing occasionally, Tel watched her appraisingly out of the corner of his eye. Perhaps she wasn't as unfit as he'd thought, nicely toned, actually. She winced at one of the movements, and then did it again. Some grit to her, too. Not really his type, of course. He looked away before she could catch him watching. This round Tel called the start, ignoring the goosebumps that sprang up on his arms when the women embraced Sedar. They both ran forward, Tel choosing to take the left this time, and Taija Kosola the right. Of course he was faster, plowing straight through the shallow lake. He used his flow of air to send up an obscuring spray of water in front of himself as he ran. Again, Entiro was hurrying to intercept him, while a smugly confident sailor ambled in Taija Kosola's direction. Their single, small webs of setting clashed. The amount of power they were allowed to feed into them strictly limited by the rules to allow players with wildly different strength to match each other. Some of the best professional players could barely channel, but here dexterity, fitness, and wits were what mattered. Antiro was irritatingly successfully tangling his flow of sedin and moving to stop Tel from getting by when, with a yell of surprise, he suddenly face-planted. Glancing to his right, Tell saw a determined-looking Taija Kosola charging towards Sailor and the ball flying towards him over Entiro's prone form. He was already sprinting to catch it and push through to the goal, using his own web to hold Entiro down. Judging by the look of concentration on Sailor's face, she was even now fighting with the power too. Light Taija Kosola must be fast. In a fraction of a second, she'd shifted her web from Entiro to the ball and to Sailor. He wasn't sure he could have done that. As he rounded the other player's ridge, he glanced behind him to see Taija Kosola tackle Sailor with a yell of triumph. He flung the ball ahead of him, his throw perfectly accurate, sending it straight through the goal. Bang! When Tell came back round the ridgeline to the center of the pitch, he saw a grumpy-looking Entiro picking himself up and brushing the mud out of his beard. On the other side of the pitch, a grinning Sailor seemed to have somehow managed to get on top of a squirming Taija Kosola. Well, that had been an unexpected victory. Maybe this day wouldn't be so bad after all. After Sailor had been persuaded to let her up, he gave Taija Kosola a far more appraising look as they walked back to their side of the pitch together. Her chest was heaving from the exertion while he'd barely gotten started. She was also covered in dirt, her hair in disarray, but Tell could see the excitement thrumming through her. He wasn't even sure she realized how predatory her grin looked under her deep brown eyes as they started discussing a plan for the third round. The second round had been much more fun than the first. Taija hadn't been confident enough in what she was doing or what was going on around her the first time. But in the second, she'd been surprised at how easy it had been to slip her web around, evading and out-maneuvering her opponents. She'd even managed to tackle Sailor. She hadn't seen that coming. Sure, she'd ended up on top after a brief, laughing scuffle, but Taija had still taken her off her feet. Of course, Taija was under no illusion now, and Tiro and Sailor were going to throw everything they had at her and tell Janin. He'd actually given her a proper smile after the second round, though. Really, he should smile more often. It had looked good on him. With a shout, Entiro started the third round, and they were both off. It seemed that this time Entiro was targeting Taija, while Sailor was marking Tel Janin. Entiro met her as she rushed through the trees, probing ahead of herself with her web of air. At the last second, Taija felt the resistance of Entiro's web, barreling straight for her. With a yelp, she jumped to the side, instinctively wrapping her own web around his and diverting it away. She kept running towards him, matching his web with the precisely measured strength of her own to keep it off her. Of course, Entiro was perfect happy for Taija to try to tackle him. He was probably more than double her weight, but she had other plans. A momentary release of her web allowed his unseen one to swing towards her, frighteningly fast. Re-establishing hers at the last second, she guided his just over her head, accelerating it away before whipping her own web back into him, forcing him to stagger aside with a surprised grunt and letting her spring past him. Holding Entiro's web away from her with jabs of her own, Taija sprinted towards the opposing goal with a shout of, "Tell Janin." He had Sailor pinned on the ground, using his superior strength while they wrestled with the power. At Taija's shout, he looked up and made a split-second decision. Taija saw Sailor's web suddenly start pushing against an unseen obstacle and thump unto Tel Janin, launching him off her, but the ball was already flying towards her, propelled by Sedin. Entiro had recovered and was charging towards Taija at terrifying speed, but she caught the ball and flung herself forward, covering the last few meters to the goal, diving ahead and flinging the ball through it just before Entiro could run her over. Bang! Tell stood up, resisting the urge to wince at the pain where Sailor had clunked his arm with her web. It seemed they'd won again. To the sound of laughter, Entiro and Taija Kosola emerged from behind the ridge. She was definitely limping, and even more covered in grass and mud than before. Her hairband must have gone missing at some point because her hair was loose. But what really caught Tell's eye was her big, open grin. "That was amazing. I thought you were going to crush me, Entiro. You need to be more careful." "Careful? If I give you the slightest leeway, you'll have me upside down and tied to a tree." Entiro theatrically rubbed his side. "I might need to get healing later after what you did to my ribs." On seeing Tell, Taija Kosola's eyes lit up more. "Tell Janin, you were great. I can't believe you just let Sailor hit you like that to throw me the ball." She gave Sailor a sideways look, hustling over to him. "Are you okay? She didn't hit you too hard, did she?" No, I'm fine. It was just a friendly slap. Anyway, I'll get my revenge in the next round. Tell straightened up and looked down, meeting Taija Kosola's deep brown eyes with his own icy blue ones. There was a moment of something, and then he found a grin slowly growing on his face, matching her own. It was at that moment Tell realized he might be in trouble. They played a few more rounds before. By mutual agreement, they agreed that their bodies could only take so much and headed for the showers. Sailor took a moment to heal the other three's bruises, and then he returned the favor for her. It really did make these sorts of games so much more fun when you didn't have to deal with the aftermath for your body. The two men were luxuriating in the hot spray of the showers when the smug question Tell had been dreading came. So what did you think of her? He shrugged noncommittally as he rinsed the shampoo out of his hair. She seems nice, I suppose. A bit different to most of the women I meet, it's true. Antiro's laughter wasn't the response he'd been expecting. Come on, you're not fooling me at all. I saw the way you were looking at her by the end. HMPH, Tell grunted irritatedly. Fine, you were right. She's pretty cool, maybe a bit soft, but I wouldn't mind hanging out with her occasionally. Antiro just kept laughing. You're not convincing anyone, you've got it bad. Afterwards, as they dressed, Tell commented to Antiro, I was quite impressed by how fast Taija Kosola seemed to be able to spin and manipulate her web. She must spend a lot of time practicing. Antiro gave him an odd look. Why would you say that? Well, I assume she's not all that strong in the power, right? At Entiro's blank look, he tried to stop digging, hurriedly adding, not that that's important, of course, but I was just wondering. There's a certain confidence, arrogance, that most powerful Aes Sedai have, but not her. Also, I think she mentioned she'd come here on the bus, and I've never seen her at the Hall of Servants. He trailed off as Entiro burst out laughing. Oh, you poor fool. What? I'm tempted to just leave you to put your foot in it and see what happens, but I'll give you this one for free. Taija's a total sweetheart, yes, but she's probably the most powerful channeler in this city. Top 2 or 3 definitely. Who did you think was going to make the gateway for us to go home tomorrow? We all know you'll be gone far too early for me and Sailor. Ah, yep, so maybe be careful what you say to her. She's normally pretty chilled. He thought for a second. Actually, weirdly so when it comes to channeling, you're right. She doesn't act like most strong Aes Sedai. She really is a bit of an oddball at times, he added affectionately. But I dare say she might be able to give even the great Tel'Janin a nasty shock if she put her mind to it. After changing, all 4 of them went out for dinner and drinks. Taija had looked at her watch a few times early on, but conversation flowed freely, as did food and drink, until ended up deep in conversation with her. She'd seemed fascinated by his life as a sportsman, asking all kinds of questions about it to the point that he started feeling like some kind of a test subject. At some point, Antiro and Sailor had discreetly disappeared. Tell couldn't put his finger on when. Normally, he'd have been a bit annoyed at being left stuck with a random woman they were trying to set him up with, but this time he found he didn't mind. Taija didn't seem to mind either and kept on with her interrogation. So you're telling me you're actually famous? She tilted her head to the side and looked skeptically at him out the side of her eyes. Tell groaned. Yes, and honestly, it's very overrated. So you're not just trying to impress me. Guys do that sometimes, but it doesn't work. Tell wasn't sure how drunk she actually was at this point. Actually, he wasn't sure how drunk he was either. No, it's good that you're not impressed. Oh, so you're not trying to impress me then? Ouch! Tell's groan of frustration was stifled by the sight of her amused grin. As the drink flowed, they found they had a mutual love of history, mutual affectionate frustration with Entiro, and a mutual dislike for some of the more staid elements of society. But all too soon, the bar was closing, and Taija was blearily looking at her watch before jolting upright. Crap, I'm meant to be lecturing tomorrow morning. Fuck this morning, I need to go. Before Tell could protest, she was grabbing her bag and phone and climbing out from behind the table, a bit wobbly on her feet. He quickly stood too, panicking slightly. Wait, hold on. He tried to think of something to say. How are you going to get home? That was rather less smooth than his normal game. Goosebumps suddenly sprang up along his arms and legs, and Taija's face slipped into an almost comical look of exaggerated focus before she slumped slightly. No, I am way too drunk to travel, she muttered to herself. Then she looked up at him and smiled. Don't worry, I'll get a taxi, but I've really got to go. Tell found himself lost for words, sudden indecision hitting him in a way that it hadn't for the best part of a century, at least when it came to women. Taija, can I? He started to say. Taija cut him off by going onto tiptoes and giving him a kiss on the cheek. You're nice once you lighten up. I like you, she muttered, and then smiled before sticking her tongue out slightly in concentration. Here, a white paper napkin floated off the table and unfolded itself before a series of finely formed numbers seemed to burn into it. A pause, and then a smiley face, and a pair of excess below it. Job done. Taija stopped focusing so much, and the napkin floated into his hand. Call me. As Tell watched Taija's slim form disappear out the door, he was impressed despite himself. He couldn't remember the last time a woman had left him so off balance, and he had to admit, her ability to perfectly burn her number into a paper napkin while completely off her face without setting half the restaurant on fire was kind of intriguing. That had been the first time the two of them had met, but obviously not the last. Taija still fondly remembered how one night a couple of years later they'd been snuggling on Tell's sofa, and he pulled out the napkin with her number on it just to prove he'd kept it. It had been a lovely evening of reminiscing about their first date, but the thing that still made her smile the most was when he'd asked her, "So that day, back when we first met, did you really have no idea who I was?" Taija's musical laughter had filled the room. Don't be ridiculous, Tell. Of course I knew. Everyone knew who you were. I'm pretty sure there was a poster of you up in the postgrads bar at the university. You were just so stern and full of yourself, I just couldn't let you have the satisfaction. His annoyed grump had mixed in nicely with her giggles. The present day. In an abandoned farmhouse near Falmey, Taija rolled over in her empty bed, resisting the urge to reach for someone who wasn't there, who'd never be there again, and tried to force herself to fall asleep. Chapter 28. The Great Hunt for the Wonder Girls. Chapter text, Chapter Roman 22. The Great Hunt for the Wonder Girls. Taija spent the first few days after her arrival walking around Falmey, exploring and watching. She'd seen too many operations go horribly wrong in the past to just charge in blindly when she had no idea what was going on. Charging in could come later, so she walked through the streets and alleys and talked to anyone who seemed willing to speak with a slightly confused traveling merchant. Coincidentally, she frequently found herself walking past the palaces and other civic buildings occupied by the Cinchen, watching and noting everything she saw. As she'd been reminded by her time in the White Tower, Taija wasn't a very good spy, but being there without support, without anything other than her own wits, and the power meant she had no choice. A few things stood out: the sheer number of Cinchen soldiers. There must have been an army garrisoned there. It really was an invasion like Siyuan had said. Also the Grome, horrible creatures, just like in the mirror world with Mirin. Taija shuddered to herself whenever she saw them. More for the reminder of Mirin than their own unpleasantness. She'd seen far worse. Luckily, that wasn't an uncommon reaction to the creatures from the other inhabitants of Falmey, so she didn't stand out. However, the thing that struck Taija most was the leashed. Women in grey dresses, cloaked in diffidence and submission, walking around with their eyes downcast. A silvery leash connected them to some kind of handler wearing a bracelet. The handlers also had their own uniforms, which Taija noted with a certain degree of anticipation would make them easy to identify. Every leashed could channel. Most were relatively weak, but some were not insignificant. Imitating the people around her, Taija refused to look directly at the leashed and their handlers, but she saw enough. The easy confidence of the handlers, even occasional signs of affection, like you might give a dog. The way that their eyes scanned the crowds. Also the utter submission of the leashed, who rarely took their eyes off their feet, their body language completely broken. Taija quickly learnt that sometimes the leashed would point a woman out, and she would be grabbed, and a collar put around her neck, never to be seen again. No one could tell her why for sure, although one shopkeeper did admit in a whisper that he saw a woman taken and then reappear in a grey dress, walking tamely behind a handler a month later. From the dead look in his eyes, she suspected he'd known the woman. Of course, it was fairly clear that this happened when the leashed felt another woman who could channel. Taija silently blessed the webs she'd spun around herself. Otherwise, she suspected half the city would be on fire. More worrying was the leasht's willingness to betray other women. That suggested either a terrifying level of control over them, or that they were so broken into their position that they would fight to stay in enslavement. Taija had seen it before, in people who'd been in the hands of the shadow for too long. Semirage and Greendel were particularly. She shuddered again. As she explored the town, Taija could feel her anger bubbling away underneath her outwardly placid exterior. What were these people doing to Egwene? Every day she was having to work increasingly hard to keep her temper under control, and whenever she saw one of the leashed it would spike, threatening to boil over. It was on Taija's fourth day in Falme that she saw a familiar shock of curly red hair over a stained brown dress ducking down an alleyway. Could it be? Without breaking stride, she turned on her heel and headed after the girl. A minute later, and she was almost certain it was Elaine. It was a little far, but Taija thought she could feel the ability to channel in her, and she knew from Asni that Elaine hadn't been captured. Taija wanted to shout out, but at the same time she didn't want to draw attention to the two of them, so she quickened her stride to catch up. Elaine turned down another alley, and then a third. Then, to Taija's relief, she slowed to examine something on the ground. Elaine. Taija reached out to her as she started to speak, only to have to twist aside with a shriek of surprise when a knife flashed through where her stomach had been a fraction of a second ago. Thought instantly became action, and the air solidified around Elaine before she could even withdraw her arm. Fuck, you could have killed me. Taija hissed at her, struggling to keep her voice down as Elaine frantically struggled against her bonds. Taija looked down and saw a slash down the fabric at the front of her dress. Fuck. What the fuck would I have done if you'd stabbed me? There's no one who can even heal me here. Elaine's struggle slowed at that, and she looked at Taija sideways. Taija Sedai, is that you? Her voice got louder and more excited as she spoke. Great, now you recognize me, Taija grumbled, but she did release the web around Elaine, only to be almost bowled over as the girl threw herself at her, burying her face in Taija's hair. Oh, light you came. I didn't know what to do. They got Egwene, and me and Nynaeve were going to free her, but then they caught Nynaeve too. Min's here. Who was Min? She's working as a servant in the leashed kennels, and the stories she tells me. They're hurting them. She's not even telling me everything. I just know it, but they're hurting them, they're training them, breaking them like dogs. Elaine's voice trailed off into sobs as she shuddered against her. It sounded worse than Taija had feared, or maybe better if Egwene and Nynaeve were still holding out. She didn't know how they broke their slaves, but she'd seen enough over the years that she didn't want to imagine. One thing was for sure, though, she couldn't leave anyone in those kinds of conditions. Frankly, it would be better to be dead. If someone was exposed to them for long enough, they might as well be. As Taija stood there awkwardly patting Elaine on the back, she was already accelerating her plans. A quick look around to check for witnesses, and Taija opened a gateway straight to the abandoned farmhouse. She turned into a base outside the town, gently tugging a still sniffling Elaine after her. The poor girl was unsurprisingly exhausted and hungry. A warm meal, gentle deflection of questions about how Taija could channel in Falme without being caught. If she could hide her ability, why wouldn't she be able to hide her webs? And a warm bedroll, and Elaine was quietly snoring away in no time. Taija, on the other hand, still had work to do. It was back to Falme for her. She needed one last bit of information before she was ready to act. Taija emerged from the alley back in her merchant persona. It wasn't long before she found a suitable target. A patrol of 5 Cincian soldiers with their weird insectal helmets coming marching towards her, and more importantly a handler and a leashed walking behind them. Taija gave the soldiers a low curtsy before ducking into an alley. This was going to be tricky. She waited an endless feeling couple of seconds. The timing had to be just right. Wait. Now. Taija drew hard on Sedar, inverting webs even as she spun them, splitting heavy flows 4 ways. A barrier against sound briefly appeared between the leashed and the soldiers. At the same time, she slammed a shield of spirit into the leashed and grabbed her and her handler in great fists of air before yanking them back into the alleyway with her. They barely had time for a shout of surprise before Taija was opening a gateway, letting the sound barrier dissipate and stepping out of Falme again. However, when Taija emerged from the gateway with her squirming, air-wrapped packages floating behind her, she found she was not alone in the dimming evening light. A group of armed men wheeled to face her, drawing swords with shouts of surprise, and the light of Sedar sprung up around a small, plump woman with an ageless face. She was strong, too strong for Taija to just shield her. She must have had an angriel. Of course, Taija had her own, but she also needed to keep the leashed shielded, hold off the soldiers, and protect Elaine. Taija carefully spun a nasty pair of inverted webs while holding her hands out in front of her, palms open. There's no need for violence, I can explain. She tensed her leg muscles, ready to dive aside as soon as she threw her opening shots. Before she could move, Elaine came running out of the farmhouse with a familiar face in tow. Wait, don't kill her, she's a friend. Taija's irritation at the idea that they would be able to kill her broke into a smile when she saw the man with Elaine, Rand. She took a step forward only to be faced by what felt like a wall of drawn swords. It was very annoying. It wasn't like they were actually a threat to her anyway. It took a little while, but eventually everyone calmed down. The Sheenarans Taija, of course, knew once she recognized them under their armor, and Rand was there with his friends. The Aes Sedai was new, but she introduced herself as Verin with a slightly absent-minded smile, declaring that she'd heard so much about you. It was good to see them all, but particularly Rand who, when he realized who Taija was under her web illusion, actually picked her up in a bear hug and swung her round, ignoring her protests. As soon as he put her down, he was embarrassed and blushing. I'm sorry, Taija said. I thought you were dead. After the stone end, he hesitated. The woman, I just didn't see how you could have survived. Suppressing both the creaking in her ribs from where he'd squeezed her, he was a big man, and the irritation at being grabbed without warning. Taija smiled warmly at him. I'm surprisingly hard to kill. Her smile faded a bit. I've heard that from a few people recently. Hopefully there won't be any. Anyway, what have you been doing? What are you doing here? I thought you were on the other side of the continent. How did you get here? There was something missing too. Rand winced and the chatter around them paused for a second at that question. That is, another stone. He clearly didn't want to talk about it, but it got Taija's mind wandering. Surely he hadn't brought all of these people. She'd have burnt herself out, even with an angriel. We were in Kerhian, and we even had the horn, and Matt's dagger. But Fane took it back and was still following him. He's in Falmy and we're going to get them back. Matt did look even sicklier than before, actually. Rand leaned in closer and lowered his tone. Also, that woman, she told me Egwene is being kept prisoner here. He looked around nervously as if mentioning Mirren might make her appear. For fuck's sake, why does Mirren fucking ruin everything? Taija caught herself and switched back to the common tongue. Matt seemed to be staring at her. He really didn't look healthy. So you're saying she might turn up here? Rand shrugged helplessly. I don't know. She told me that she was doing me a favor and then would leave me to it. But I don't exactly trust her. Well, at least you're not a complete fool. Taija gave him a small smile to take the sting out of the words. On the inside, she was thinking hard. If Mirren was going to interfere, then her plans would fall apart violently, but it sounded like she wasn't planning to do anything. She had no choice. She needed to go ahead anyway. She stopped herself from shuddering. She had an angriel now. That would make it okay. It would have to, surely. She wanted Lanfear dead more than almost anything else in the world. If she could have that and tell back, she could die happy, but she was very strong. Rand gave her an unamused look. But Taija, you haven't said, what are you doing here? Funnily enough, I'm here to rescue Egwene too, and Nynaeve, it would seem. It's a small world. He gave her a confused look. It seemed like that was another expression that didn't carry over properly to the common tongue. After a second, Rand seemed to properly process what Taija had said. Nynaeve's been captured too, she nodded. I've been in the White Tower helping. Yes, let's say helping the Amulin with some tasks, and when the girls were kidnapped and brought here, I followed. She hadn't realized Verin had been listening until she asked curiously, if you do not mind me asking, why would the Amulin send you instead of a full party of sisters? Taija frowned briefly, and then gave her an innocent smile. I think I was all she could be spare. The dumpy Aes Sedai looked a bit perturbed at that. She turned back to Rand, realizing what she was missing. Rand, where's Alexei? Taija desperately hoped he was okay. He should have been with the Sheenarans. Rand saw her worried face and laughed happily. Don't worry, he's just getting water. He'll be back any minute. As promised, Alexei did return a few minutes later for another happy reunion. He even treated Taija with the dignity she expected and settled for a tight hug. Light, it was good to see the first person she knew in this world again. The interrogation of the leashed, and what Taija found was uncreatively called a leash holder didn't take long. They were both trembling with fear and begging to be protected from the one who must be leashed, and even more so the man who'd imprisoned them. The leashed one was violently shivering and kept crying that she couldn't see the weaves. They seemed terrified of Verin. It must have been something to do with her being an unleashed channeler. Taija couldn't see any other reason. They also shied away from any of the men, presumably convinced that one of them was channeling. Taija, on the other hand, didn't scare them as much. As far they could tell, she couldn't channel after all. So when she decided to swallow her disgust and play good cop to the threat of a power-mad channeler's bad cop, it was surprisingly effective. Taija quickly established that the woman in the grey dress was called Suki and the leash holder was Corin. Promises to protect them from punishment by the ones who must be leashed got her tearful explanations of their frankly disgusting philosophy and how the leash holder was able to train and restrain the leashed using her leash. The whole thing repulsed her. It was as bad as anything the shadow did to people, just with a veneer of civilization painted on top. When Taija had heard enough, she released the web of air around Suki, reassuring her that soon she would be free. She started to explore the contours of the collar round her neck, using both her fingers and tiny flows of the power. That quickly came to a halt when the woman started to cry and beg Taija not to free her. Corin's voice was proud, defiant. Suki is a good leashed. She knows what is right. Oof! She was cut off by a web of air from Verin striking her in the stomach. Taija glanced at the Aes Sedai to see a look of repulsion on her face before looking back at Corin, all pretense of kindness gone. I find every word that leaves your lips disgusting. If you're not a dark friend, then doing this to someone is the next thing to it. Unlike her words, her tone was conversational. You're currently walking on very thin ice, so I would choose your words carefully, or better yet not speak unless spoken to. If not, I can give you to the one who must be leashed. Corin's mouth snapped shut, and Taija went back to examining the collar, doing her best to ignore Suki's sobs, until her probes of the power found a hidden mechanism. A small flex, and it sprang open to a cry of despair from Suki, who threw herself at Corin's feet and clung onto them, babbling about how she would be good and not to let the one who must be leashed take her. Verin seemed to be taking notes now, a small notebook in her hand. He looked up when Taija turned away from the weeping leashed in frustration. So you're the Taija I've heard much about you from the men. Her tone was curious but vague, like she had other things to think about. Taija offered her a shallow bow. At your service, Verin. The woman hadn't been rude to her yet, so she wouldn't stand on formality and insist on titles. How is it that you joined up with the group? Oh, well, she smiled if she just realized. I thought I could offer them some assistance in their hunt. Sadly, my efforts have been a bit limited, but it has certainly been fascinating. Who would have thought so much could happen with so few people and 3 people who alter the pattern too? Well, I'm sure they've been glad of the help. Oh, hopefully. So tell me, Taija. Her tone was guileless, all innocent curiosity. Where are you from? I do not recognize your name. Taija offered her an awkward shrug. I've been known by other names too, but originally I'm from a small village in the mountains of Mist. I doubt you'd have heard of it. How fascinating. I would love to hear all about it. Her enthusiasm seemed unfeigned. I'd be delighted to tell you, Taija deflected, but I think his time too short. The men are planning to make their attempt for the horn tomorrow, and I think some more discussion is needed. Will you be assisting them with their mission? Oh no, I would just bring the leash down upon them, more of a hindrance than a help, especially limited as I am by the 3 oaths. Vile as the actions of the Sentient are, not all evil comes from the Dark One. That night found Taija sitting with the 3 boys, Alexei Tar and his lieutenants Mesmer and Uno, with Verin listening interestedly. They had what sounded to her like a very shaky plan to break into the palace that they knew contained the horn and presumably Matt's dagger. Normally, she'd have preferred to attack at night, the advantages of technology meaning that she could see like it was daylight, but in this place and time that wasn't an option for her. While there were webs that would allow her to see in the dark, they weren't good enough for a combat situation, and the biggest risk she was likely to face was someone being able to sneak up on her. No, better to go in full daylight. Taija had channeled a small model of Falmy's most important buildings into the dirt. So you're saying that this is the palace with the horn in it? At the men's nods, she smiled. Good. I'm not interested in that one. Here's what I want from you. A circle formed around another, slightly smaller palace. This is the palace of the High Lady Surath. Don't go near this building under any circumstances. Another formed around the leashed kennels. This is where they keep the leashed. Keep away from here too for your own good. Ingtar dipped his head. Peace, Taija, said I. We are no fools. We do not wish to fight their collared eyes, said I. He missed the sharp look Verin gave him. Good. Keep away from those two buildings, whatever you do. Now my other request is that you wait for my signal before you act. I will also be going into the town. Taija glanced at Rand, seeking to rescue some wayward girls from the Cinchen. I can't directly help you, but what I promise is that if you wait for my signal, the guards in your palace will be distracted. A bit more planning wrapped up the evening, and they all retreated to get what sleep they could. Now that they were united again, Taija took the opportunity to ward Rand's dreams along with her own. Fortunately, before Taija went to sleep, she remembered that Elaine's friend, the Min girl, would also be in Falme. She certainly didn't want her dead for the bad luck of having been caught by the Cinchen. Luckily, she had Alexei, and a whispered conversation with him and Elaine meant he could go into the town tomorrow morning and get her out before everything started to happen. After a final promise to Alexei that she'd tell him everything that had gone on once they had a bit more privacy, Taija tried to fall asleep. Maybe the Aes Sedai had a point about warders being useful. Taija slept fitfully, her rest interrupted by both the noises of the night and bad dreams. However, the next morning she rose early. During the sleepless periods of the night she'd been thinking. She'd had enough of hiding, enough of dancing around, permanently in disguise, pretending to be something she wasn't. She was never made for subterfuge, and it had been wearing on her, adding to the long list of things that were grinding her down. It would always have its place, but after today, it was going to be much harder to stay hidden anyway. Taija knew she'd be giving away advantages with what she was planning to do, but spending them to rescue Egwene from being turned into some sort of pet for the Cinchen didn't seem like too high a price. Nynaeve too, she supposed. After her morning ablutions, Taija spun a mirror into the air in front of her and then untied the web, changing her looks. Her features rippled briefly, and then she was facing her own familiar deep brown eyes. It was good to be back. Taija's momentary satisfaction was quickly doused in cold water when Elaine, who'd been watching curiously, said, "I thought you'd be taller," in a disappointed tone, before clamping her hands over her mouth in horror and muttering something about people who alter the pattern. Taija gave her a deeply unamused look and stalked off to get changed. There were perils to always walking around under illusion, but still. Out of sight of the rest, Taija pulled the trousers she'd made in Tar Valon out of her packs. It might be socially inappropriate for this time, but she needed to be able to move freely and quickly. Also, frankly, she was tired of dressing like she was in a medieval fantasy. Sturdy brown trousers, riding boots, a light blue blouse, and embroidered brown woolen overcoat completed her outfit. It wasn't what she really wanted to be wearing, but going into combat, it was an infinite improvement over the floor-length dresses she'd been stuck in. Ignoring the looks from the men, and Elaine's gasped, "Taija," said I. Taija strode out of the farmhouse, her mind already on the day ahead. It seemed there'd been some discussion during the night while she'd slept, and she thought Rand stayed up practicing with his sword. Whatever had happened, only 5 of them headed towards Falme to rescue the Horn. Rand, Perrin, Mat, Ingtar, and Hurin. Verin smiled enigmatically when Taija asked her why and said, "Some things are simply meant to be." Taija shrugged, refusing to take the bait of Aes Sedai mysteriousness, and just exchanged a glance with Alexei, who nodded, before giving her a salute, Sheena in style, and then jumping onto his horse to head for the town too. She hoped they hadn't rubbed off on him too much. After the 5, plus Alexei, had gone, Taija turned to Elaine, Verin, and the others. "I will be making my own move shortly. Mesma, Uno, I would be very grateful for you and your soldiers' protection for a while. I'll be working with the power, but won't have any concentration to spare." They replied instantly with fists to breastplates and calls of honor to serve. Taija, said I. Verin, said I, as you're unable to fight, would you be able to stay here and guard Kareen and Suki? She'd left them in a tied-off box of air with the shield on Suki also tied off, although she'd suspected that even without it, the former leashed wouldn't have channeled. Verin nodded, seemingly unperturbed by her taking charge. Taija continued, I'd also be grateful if you could keep Elaine safe and make sure she doesn't do anything foolish. Elaine leapt up from the stump she'd been sitting on, practically vibrating with outrage. Taija, I'm going to help, you need me. Taija shook her head and spoke gently, but firmly, ignoring Elaine's failure to use her title. Elaine, I know you want to help and your bravery does you credit, but you are a child. She held up a hand to stop her immediate protest. You would be in great danger, and I don't put children in danger by choice. I'm proud of you for what you've done to try to rescue Egwene and Nynaeve, but I'm here now and I will not let you or them get hurt. But I can help. Taija said, I please. You know I'm one of the strongest women in the tower. Only Nynaeve is stronger than me. Taija shook her head again. Elaine, you're strong, and one day you'll be stronger, no doubt, but you're not ready for this. Verin. Verin nodded in agreement, putting a comforting hand on Elaine's shoulder. Taija is quite right, child. You will be much better staying here with me and helping guard the leash holder and leashed. That town is no place for a novice. I am sure Taija will be back with your friends in no time. She looked at Taija quizzically. What exactly is it that you are planning, Taija? Taija smiled and turned to look towards the town. I'm going to bring the light to Falme. Annoyingly, no one reacted to her words, other than to look at her confusedly. Light bringers, she added in a slightly questioning tone to no better reaction, although Verin looked intrigued. Oh well, she sighed. It had meant something once. Taija glanced over at the prisoners and then called out, Sheenaran's with me. Spinning an inverted gateway, she quickly stepped through, followed by nervous troopers, clearly uncomfortable with the one power. Verin's fascinated gaze followed her through the hole in the air. Taija had chosen a spot a good few kilometers from the town, shielded from direct sight by the rolling hills surrounding it. More importantly, she was also a good way away from where she'd left Verin and Elaine. She wanted to attract attention away from them, not towards them. Once I begin, I'll need total concentration for an hour, so I'll need you to guard me from any sentient patrols. You know your trade better than me. I leave how you do it in your hands, but if I'm distracted, the effects could be catastrophic. Taija paused. To be clear, I mean all of us die kind of catastrophic. The soldiers blanched before saluting and assured her nothing, and no one would bother her while they lived. There were advantages to the way people saw the one power in this time. Thank you. One final thing, once you see the light, do not look in my direction under any circumstances, not if you value your eyesight. Taija met each of their eyes, emphasizing the point with her expression. Orders given, she continued her preparations, while nervous-looking Sheenarans spread out away from her. She suspected they were going a bit further away than military tactics would strictly require, but there was no harm in that. A simple web of earth rapidly excavated a large hole in the ground, building up a solid rampart of leftover dirt around it. Taija smoothed a small spot into the wall of earth for herself, and then scrambled up onto it. Complex calculations flashed through her mind: location, direction, movement, other variables. Almost time to begin. After a few minutes, she was satisfied and waved to those of the Sheenarans that were still in sight before sitting down cross-legged on the wall of earth, staring down into the hole. A deep breath, and Taija opened herself fully to Sedar, drawing through her angriel to far beyond her normal full strength. She was deliberately close to Falme to create more of a distraction for the leashed, but it was a calculated risk. Doing that during the war would have been fatally stupid, but these people couldn't travel. She really hoped not anyway. First was the framework, a spherical lattice of all 5 elements. Its complexity was extremely taxing even for Taija, and she was conscious that the amount of Sedar she was channeling might well have already been felt if any patrols were between her and Falme. Slowly, she built the lattice, labyrinth, thick flows of Sedar coming together, forming an ever stronger shell. She didn't realize she was biting her bottom lip as she sat there in utter concentration, staring into the hole, no attention to spare for anything other than this intricate task. Bit by bit, the sphere solidified before Taija's eyes. She didn't try to invert it. She didn't have the concentration. It was taking every bit of her skill to hold the web in place and keep adding to it without making the task even more complicated. Anyway, it wasn't like anyone in this time would have much chance of replicating it. Each time she completed a part, she carefully tied it off. She couldn't channel anywhere near enough to actively hold the whole web. She doubted anyone could without a sangreal, and if she'd had one of those, there would have been easier, better options. It was a cool autumn day, but Taija was sweating as the sphere of Sedar grew thicker and thicker. Complex flows of spirit wove control inputs into its surface. Thick, ultra-dense webs of all 5 elements wrapped around it, tightening in place. One mistake in this web, and she knew she'd kill herself and probably everyone near her. It must have been nearly an hour before Taija was done, letting the torrential flow of Sedar through her ease off a bit. She realized she was gasping for breath and drenched in sweat, but she'd done it. Surveying her work with careful eyes, she couldn't see any flaws. If she was honest, she doubted she'd see them until it was too late anyway. At least if there were any, she wouldn't need to worry about it for long. Survey complete, Taija gave herself a couple of minutes to recover. Soon things would be happening fast. When her breathing was back to normal, she drew heavily on Sedar once again and directed the power with exquisite care at the sphere in front of her. This time it was only fire that she channeled. One heavy flow straight into a precise point in the sphere designated by a beautifully intricate pattern of spirit. Where before it would have been invisible to anyone who couldn't channel Sedar, now a gradually increasing glow could be seen. Once it got going, the air inside the sphere heated rapidly, quickly going from glowing to fiery to white-hot to blinding. Absently, Taija spun a web over her eyes, blocking out most light, but she still couldn't look directly at it, and she was very conscious that there was a beacon of light blazing into the sky above her. Nothing she could do about it, but the Tseentchen would certainly be on their way now. That was part of the plan, of course, to draw them away from Falme. Taija held the flows for long minutes of heavy channeling, feeding more and more fire into the sphere until she decided it was ready. Reaching out with spirit, she tweaked one thread in the intricate web. Immediately the sphere started to collapse, falling in on itself at an achingly slow pace. There was no going back now. Despite that, Taija couldn't help but have doubts. But no, she needed a distraction, and this would provide that. Assuming she survived the next hour, the Forsaken would be hearing about it soon enough anyway, and it really would be the return of a classic. Taija stopped feeding in more fire. Her eyes were now screwed shut, but she could still see the glowing sphere through both her web and her eyelids. Numbers flew through her head, nearly there. 2 seconds, 1 now. Simultaneously, she opened a small inverted gateway in front of the sphere, spun protection around her ears, tugged on another thread of spirit on its surface, and dived backwards off her earthen embankment, tumbling roughly to the grass below. There was a moment of nothing, and then there was only light and sound. Pater was pulling his cart into one of Falme's many squares, ignoring his aching back. His mind was already on what he might be able to sell today. Muttering to himself about stingy Tseentchen and penniless locals, he came to an abrupt halt when he saw a small hole open in the air between him and the High Lady Seroth's palace. He shook his head. This was probably Tseentchen business, something to do with their filthy damning, and he wanted no part of that. He just turned around, and there was only blinding light. The High Lady Seroth dismissed the Daku veil with a gesture of her fingers. Soon she would have to go and speak to. He stood on the balcony, overlooking the town, sipping from a goblet of more than adequate wine. Things were coming together nicely. The boy was in Falme and would soon be in his hands, or failing that at least another step further down the road to turning. The girls would be shipped off to Tseentchen. They couldn't support the boy there, and something useful could be made of them, 2 birds with 1 stone. Then, once he had the boy, it would be the beginning of the end. His musings came to a crashing stop when he saw a gateway open in the square below. He felt nothing. Sedar then, or possibly inverted Sedin. It couldn't be the boy, or one of these so-called Aes Sedai, but none of the chosen would come here when he'd made it clear that he had private business to attend to. Concerning, he'd have to investigate. With a sigh, he put his goblet down. Then a thought struck him, an almost forgotten memory. With a curse, he dived for the floor, spinning a sphere of protection as he fell and throwing his arm across his eyes. Then there was only light and all-encompassing sound, his bones, the very building shaking with the shrieking roar that tore through at his ears. An endless second later it was over. He picked himself off the floor, letting his web dissipate, but already suspecting what he would see. On the other side of the square, the High Lady Seroth's palace had simply ceased to exist, an upward sloping gouge carved through the ground, and then the palace leaving nothing at the front, and only a few feet of heat-warped walls at the back. The square itself seemed to be transformed to black fused glass everywhere in front of that gateway. His face hardened. This would have to be dealt with. Was it an assassination attempt? If that attack was what he thought it was. Well, there were not many people capable of it, and even fewer left alive, perhaps only Lanfear. He turned to leave, ready to bring death on whoever had had the temerity to interfere with his plans, and then hesitated. Would he have time before the boy? The boy was the most important thing. That was when he heard the voice. When she heard the voice, Renna sprang to her feet, along with a number of other Soldum. Clearly, the return was under attack by Merith Damin. She would be needed. As soon as Taija could safely open her eyes, she was channeling. A small gateway into the air above Falme, a web to amplify her voice to deafening proportions. She left the protection around her ears in place, even as she released the web shielding her eyes. She'd seen that Suki had fought to stay enslaved. What was more, she'd seen it too many times with others in the past. Give someone to the shadow, or to anybody brutal enough, she supposed, for long enough and they'd break. Stop being the person they once were, and do anything for their enslaver, fight to stay in captivity. She needed to move fast, and there'd be no time to stop and persuade anyone. The leashed were the biggest threat Taija would face, and however tragic it might be, if she wanted to get out alive, let alone bring the girls with her, she'd need to keep moving. Taija wasn't normally one for drama, but perhaps this was a time that deserved it. She was bringing a bit of the Age of Legends back today. With an internal wince at how pompous she was going to sound, she opened her mouth and began to speak, her tone urgent. Nynaeve sat on the bed in her small room, staring at her hands clasped together in her lap. Her knee was jiggling up and down, and she couldn't stop it. She needed to stop it, but she couldn't. She thought she'd had hard times when her parents died, when she first became wisdom, trying to protect the children from Aes Sedai manipulations, even facing the Forsaken at the eye of the world. They were nothing. One mistake 2 weeks ago, and that was it. She walked in the light. She knew the world was no paradise, but there were limits to what could be inflicted on another person. Now she was in hell and had quickly discovered that, no, there were no limits. Nynaeve bit her lip. She wouldn't cry. They could make her wail when they punished her, but she wouldn't give them that victory until the agony became too much. They'd started with soft words, treating her like a pet dog. That had quickly changed, though. She'd thought she was strong, refusing to bend an inch. They'd punished her, of course, but she'd known she was strong enough to take it. Sooner or later she'd escape. Every prison had its weaknesses. She'd been so foolish in her arrogance when she was first taken. There was no escape. There was no end. Her only hope was rescue, and every worried visit from Min, every extra day of abuse, and she shuddered, every training session with the Suldam killed a little more of that hope. She'd rather die than give in, but she knew that that wasn't a choice available to Livy the Dammin. She was rocking back and forth. Stop. She couldn't show weakness. One crack and they'd be in, prizing it open bit by bit. The Suldam had cut off her braid after the first week and taken her name, but she hadn't broken. There was no hope left, just her determination not to be broken. All she could do was survive tomorrow without breaking. Then the next day, and the next. Even when the hope had died in her heart, she would not break. They'd said if she didn't do as she was told, they would take her hands or her tongue. Damin didn't need them to channel. She wanted to scream at the thought, but she must not give in. She didn't realize she was rocking again. Then came a brief flash of light, brightening the room through her small window, followed by a roar of the Creator only knew what, so loud that the whole building shook, dust falling down on her from the ceiling beams. Nynaeve looked up with dull eyes for a second before looking down at her hands again. Something had happened, but it wasn't anything to do with a badly trained Damin. Her world ended at the walls of her room. That was when she heard the voice, booming out across the town unnaturally loud. So loud it must have shattered windows. Even through the thick walls of the damning kennel she heard it clearly, the oddly clipped words of an accented woman's voice, echoing through her body and lodging itself in her heart. Sinchen, slavers, you are an abomination against the light. To the damning and other slaves I am coming. Don't fight me. When you see me, lie down so I know you want to be free and you will not be harmed. Hold on, I am coming. As the ringing of her ears died away, Nynaeve felt a glimmer of hope. Chapter 29, Unleashed. Chapter text, chapter Roman 23, Unleashed message delivered. It was time to move. Sedar surged into Taija, and she spun her first gateway straight into the leashed kennels. With a hiss it fizzled, sending sparks of Sedar into the air. Fuck. Wards. One of the Forsaken was in Falme. No time to think. Plan B. The air split in front of Taija. A moment later she stepped through to the street outside the leashed kennels. No time for hesitation. She was already running for them at a full sprint. Squad of soldiers to the right. Fire, earth came together. They died. In front of her 4 leashed and their handlers stood, troops mounted on Grome surrounding them. 4 was too many. Eyes shut, webs over ears, Taija channeled. She still saw the flash through her eyelids, the thunderous boom in her bones. She stumbled slightly, then recovered her footing, vision and hearing free again. Chunks of paving stone had carved a hole through the formation. 2 of the leashed were dead. No time for regret. The rest were screaming, bleeding from their ears. She spun. Flows streaked out, and soldiers simply exploded. She split the threads, spinning shields and slamming them into place. The surviving leashed had already lost their connection to Sedar, no resistance. Spirit and air, their collars sprang open. Shields tied off, blades of air thrown straight through the 3 surviving leash holders, bisecting them. Taija was already past them, running through the large doors at the front of the kennels. Soldiers, more leashed in the entrance hole straight ahead. Air to deflect a fireball. More air above her to protect from stone raining down from the ceiling. Taija winced and ignored the pain as something hit her, leaving a gash in her arm. Fire, earth, spirit, split the flows. The soldiers exploded, and Taija stepped sideways through a gateway to emerge behind the leashed and their handlers. Polina threw another weave of Sedar at the small, dark woman who just charged through the doors. Something deflected it, and suddenly she was cringing back into herself as the soldiers surrounding her exploded, showering her and the other damning in chunks of flesh and bone. Why wasn't the woman glowing? Why could she only see some of her weaves? At a command from Gilla, she wove fire and air together to burn the woman where she stood. Only suddenly, the woman dived through a hole in the air. Where was she? Fire came at them from behind, ripping down the corridor they'd been guarding. Oh, light, she was behind them. She tried not to whimper as she to face her death. 2 of the damning raised shields of air, and Gilla yelled at her to attack, pushing her will down the Adam. Even as she wove, she saw out of the corner of her eye a bar of fire slam through Luki from behind, leaving a smoking hole in her chest. Where did it even come from? Were there 2 attackers? Beside her, Nella crumpled, half her chest missing. She didn't want to die. In a panic, she remembered that voice booming across the town and threw herself to the ground, trying to burrow into it, her hands covering her head as she released the power. A second later, the noise and chaos stopped, and the collar round her neck clicked open just before she heard a squelching thump to her side. It was a moment before she dared to open her eyes and look up. The terrifying woman was gone, and the only thing moving in the corridor was Gilla's body slowly sliding down the wall, leaving a trail of blood behind it. Taija was running, ignoring the burning in her lungs. If she stopped for too long, it was over. If the Cinchen got the time to organize themselves while she was trapped inside the wards, she'd die, or worse, be caught. Min had told Elaine where the girls were, but Taija had never been in this building before, so all she could do was hope she was going to the right place. She hoped Alexei was able to warn Min the leashed holding cells were obvious, and Taija ran down the corridor, webs of air slamming doors open ahead of her. At least none of the leashed were standing behind them. She quickly had to slow down to a walk. It was bad. Many of the doors she smashed open revealed terrified, leashed in their grey dresses, many of them whimpering for mercy. None was Egwene or Nynaeve, but she couldn't just leave them to their torture. A small web of spirit and air, and each was released as she passed. She didn't have time to see how they reacted. A gaggle of leash holders came running down the corridor towards Taija, and she didn't even blink as she slammed them back the way they came, in a tumble of broken bones. Where were they? Next floor. Elaine had said there were 2. Had she gone to the wrong one? Fuck. Taija came to the end of the corridor and saw the stairs up. Checking behind her, several leashed had emerged from their cells and were tentatively following her, fear clearly written on their faces. She couldn't just leave them, but she couldn't let them slow her down either. Taija shouted, "You want freedom? Come with me, but move." Breaking into a jog, she heard the sound of them pattering after her. At least they seemed to be able to keep up. Esther leaned her head around the corner. There was someone coming up the stairs. Her and Siora had completed themselves with a damning as soon as they heard the explosion, ready to report to wherever they were needed. It was an emergency, so she'd taken the first damning she reached. One of this continent's Aes Sedai before she became Pura. It wasn't ideal, she was only partly trained, but Esther prided herself on her abilities as a Dursoldum, and the Empress would not find her lacking today. She gave a mental command and felt rather than saw Sedar spring into Pura along with Siora's damning. She already knew Pura's weakness, but there were other ways. Pura was an adequately strong damning. She'd be ready. It was clear from the sounds that the battle was moving towards them and that the enemy had damning, or worse, was Merith damning. Suppressing a shudder, she took a hold of herself. She'd been in the service of the ever-victorious army for over 2 decades, and she'd faced enemy damning enough times. She knew how to fight them, and soon these intruders, be they traitors or simply enemies, would discover how foolish it was to attack the Empire here in the kennels. She caught Siora's eye, and with a nod they prepared themselves. Siora's would attack and distract. Pura would use her strength to shield and deflect. Then they arrived. A dark-skinned woman running noisily up the stairs, spatters of blood staining her immodestly masculine clothing. There was no reaction from Pura, and Esther felt nothing, so not a Merith damning. She was unarmed too, oddly dressed, but surely some kind of servant or civilian then, running from murderous invaders, a subject of the Empire. Esther moved to frantically wave at the woman to get past them before she got herself killed when everything happened at once. Heat bathed her face as Siora and her damning turned into guttering torches, and she was almost yanked off her feet as Pura dived to the floor, putting her hands on her head. The woman-forgotten Esther flexed her will through the Adam to make Pura get up, make her channel, but all she got through the Adam was a choking scream as the recalcitrant damning writhed on the ground in pain. Then the collar clicked open, and the feeling of her damning disappeared from her head. Esther looked up just in time to see the servant's eyes meet hers. Taija ran past the collapsing corpse of the leash holder, again slamming doors to leashed rooms open and releasing their collars. She was vaguely aware of the freed leashed behind her helping their fellow slaves up. This had already taken too long. Ahead of her a door swung open, and she feels Sedar flowing into someone. A lot of it. A moment later Egwene staggered out, a collar around her neck, its leash leading to a short, pale woman. Taija's met her eyes for a moment, and then Egwene shrieked with pain, falling to her knees. "I can't stop her. Please, Taija." Flows of Sedar shot out from her, directed towards Taija. Powerful, but crude. A thought, and the flows were sliced. Before they'd even snapped back into Egwene, a shield was thrown against Taija's connection to the power. As it bounced ineffectually away, her own narrow flow of inverted air and spirit had slipped past what little defenses Egwene had, and her collar sprang open. The pale leash holder stood still for a second, open-mouthed. Then Egwene screamed something incomprehensible and channeled. Flows of air lashed out from her, beating the leash holder, striking her from every angle. Egwene just stood there gripping her grey dress with white-knuckled fists, panting with rage and horror as she beat her. The leash holder collapsed to the ground, shrieking under the blows, until Taija reached Egwene and grabbed her. She was so tense it was like holding a board as Taija gently turned her away from the screaming leash holder to face her instead. The light of Sedar vanished from around Egwene, and suddenly she was collapsing against Taija, sobbing uncontrollably. "She hurt me, Taija. She just kept hurting me. All of them. They just hurt me until I gave in, until I obeyed them. I couldn't stop them from hurting me. I couldn't stop them until I did what they wanted. I hate them. I hate them so much. I want to kill them. I want to kill them all." Her voice broke against Taija's shoulder. "It's all right, Egwene. It's all right. You're all right. You don't have to kill anyone. They won't hurt you anymore. I won't let them." The leash holder was tentatively picking herself up off the floor behind Egwene, shooting terrified glances at Taija. From the way she winced, it looked like Egwene had at the very least broken some of her ribs. Taija met the leash holder's fear-filled eyes as she spun a small inverted ward against sound around her, and then a web of air. The woman's neck twisted violently. Taija gently rubbed Egwene's back as the leash holder collapsed to the floor, eyes staring lifelessly up at her. "It'll be okay, Egwene, I'm here." After a few more seconds, she spoke again. "Egwene, I need you to listen to me." She gently pushed the traumatized girl off her shoulder. "We need to keep moving. If you want to live, you need to follow me now. We're going to find Nynaeve, and then we're leaving with anyone else who can come. Do you understand?" She didn't really know how to deal with a traumatized teenager, but Egwene seemed to pull herself together with a shudder. "Nynaeve's this way." She was a strong girl. Taija was already moving, urging Egwene along. She followed, but Taija could feel her eyes lingering on the leash holder's corpse as they passed it. A couple of doors down they found Nynaeve's cell. Egwene burst in with a shout of, "Nynaeve!" And Taija followed to see Nynaeve sitting on her bed, rocking slightly and staring determinedly ahead, her face expressionless. After a moment, she looked up at them, her eyes widening. Taija channeled and her collar clicked open. Hesitantly, Nynaeve reached a hand up to her neck, and Taija absently noticed she didn't have a braid anymore. Nynaeve glanced at Taija and then looked at Egwene. What took you so long?" Her voice rasped harshly. She didn't seem to realize she was scrubbing viciously at her eyes with the grey sleeve of her dress. Slowly she got to her feet, her movements jerky, and embraced Egwene. There, it's okay. You're safe now," she murmured, her hand twitching as she rubbed it up and down Egwene's back. Taija knew she needed time, but there was none. "I'm sorry, but we need to move." Nynaeve's eyes flashed up to meet hers, and she shifted herself between Taija and Egwene. "Who are you, mistress?" "It's Taija," Egwene said. "You know her, Nynaeve." "Well, she doesn't look like Taija." "I get that a lot," Taija replied dryly. "Now, unless you want to be back in this room tonight, we have to move. I've killed a lot of people to rescue you, and even if I have to tie you up and carry you, we're leaving now." Nynaeve straightened awkwardly, her voice taking on some of its former stridency, but Taija could see her eye twitching. "Well, of course we do. What are you waiting for?" The light of Sedar sprang up around her, impressively bright. "Let's go." She was already heading for the door. Taija suspected she was in no condition to fight, but at least it was getting her moving. Nynaeve stepped out into the corridor, keeping herself from stumbling with nothing more than willpower. It felt good to have that collar off her neck and Sedar under her control rather than those filthy Sinchen. She'd die before she'd let them collar her again. Suddenly, the woman calling herself Taija was ahead of her, already running. "Follow me, don't stop for anything." The same accent, words strangely clipped short as from the voice. Nynaeve wasn't sure how she did it, but she somehow jerked into a run behind her. A hole in the air seemed to rotate open in front of them, the entrance hall of the kennels, how she hated that word, visible through it. There were people there, waiting to take her back. Then there was scalding heat washing back for a second as everything through the hole vanished in fire. She hadn't felt anything, no weaves, no Sedar, nothing. Taija was already leaping through the hole into the scorched room, the air dry and metallic tasting. Nynaeve followed behind into the blackened hall, doing her best not to look at the charred corpses dotted around it. They hadn't even had time to scream. Suddenly, Taija stopped, holding her hand up to the group. "Not the front door." Without any further warning, she span and ran to the wall. Putting her hand on it, she bit her bottom lip in concentration, and stone seemed to crumble away from her. There were still no weaves. A second later, she was dashing through a new hole in the wall, waving them after her. Nynaeve expected to emerge into bright daylight, but instead everything was shrouded in a strange mist. In the distance, she could hear the sounds of combat and screams, but everyone around her seemed to have stopped moving. In the square to their side, rows of Sinchen troops and damins stared into the sky. Even Taija had stopped, chest heaving and sweat dripping from her face as she looked into the sky open-mouthed. In the midst of the rolling clouds, two figures fought, lit by a backdrop of ethereal light. One dressed in pitch black, flames swirled around him, swinging an ashen staff. The other was Rand, fighting with a sword against what looked like the Dark One himself. Distraction could be fatal, but Taija couldn't drag her eyes away from what she was seeing above her. What the fuck was Rand doing? How did that even work? She couldn't think of any web that would do it. That wasn't even getting into the question of why Ishamael seemed to be having a sword fight with him. The man was somewhere on the wrong side of the divide between genius and insanity, but this was beyond that. Taija didn't know how long she stood there staring, only vaguely aware of the others around her. But then she heard a shout from the direction of the Cinchen. As she tore her attention from Rand's duel in the sky, she saw one of the Cinchen pointing towards her and her group. It was about to drag them back into a run, but then the light of Sedar sprung up around Egwene, a snarl tearing across her face as she screamed. "I won't go back. I'd rather die." She lashed out with a web of earth and fire, cobblestones blasting from the ground and ripping through the soldiers. Well, that had gotten their attention. There was no discreet escape to be had after that. Taija spun a large, inverted gateway to her side, leading back to the farmhouse. She could feel the strain now. She was nearing her limits. "Get out of here," she barked. When Egwene and Nynaeve hesitated, she added, "You need to get the other women to safety. I'll be right behind you." After another moment, they nodded and started hustling scared women through the gateway as Taija turned to face the Cinchen, who were rapidly organizing themselves. Absent-mindedly, she sliced a couple of webs heading in her direction. None of the leashed among them seemed to want to defy their handlers, and she was sailing too close to her limits to give them time to change their minds. As the last woman hurried through the gateway and Egwene called for Taija to follow, she let out a small breath and released the web, allowing it to rotate closed. These people couldn't be allowed to follow them. No more women broken under those disgusting collars. The cloudy turmoil in the sky provided her with useful material. Efficiency was key now. Fire, spirit, and air. She didn't bother to invert her webs. She didn't have the energy to spare to do it fast enough to be useful. Opening a gateway beside her, Taija stepped sideways as lightning flashed from the sky, exploding amidst the Cinchen formation. She emerged on top of a building on the other side of the Cinchen force, looking down on them just in time to see her previous location explode in fire. Splitting her flows, Taija channeled, spinning webs of fire and air. Small balls of fire went blasting into the Cinchen formation with blinding flashes of light and heat, sending soldiers flying. She was succeeding in devastating their formation, keeping them off balance, reacting, not acting. But there were still 10 leashed among them. It was too many. Shields were thrown at her, and she sliced them with fire and spirit. If they could link, she'd already have lost. Taija drew hard on Sedar. All 5 elements rapidly spun together, and a huge blossom of white-hot fire bloomed among the Cinchen. 8. Move. Another gateway, and she was among them, a soldier falling bisected by her gateway. A web of razor-sharp air sliced through everyone in front of her. Another leashed was turning to face her, spinning air, water, and fire. Taija turned her into a briefly shrieking torch. 7. A leash holder came at her, collar open in her outstretched hands. Air threw her sideways so hard she bowled over several soldiers. She didn't get up. Taija stumbled as a web of fire clipped her, resisting the urge to cry out. Quickly, she raised a howling circle of fire around herself, churning and shielding her from the sight of the soldiers and the leashed. Soldiers shied back, and she spun cutting webs of water and air, sending them flying out of the ring of fire. Again, Taija traveled, her gateway taking her out of the circle onto another building. Another 2 leashed lay bleeding out on the cobbles. 5. She stepped forward and stumbled as a shield nearly cut her off from the power. Barely deflected air made her wince as she felt its blast. Frantically, she sliced the webs and sent fire back after them, only to see her own webs deflected into the sky. They were hammering at her now, webs of every element rising to meet her. Taija sliced, deflected, and blocked them, barely keeping up. Then, with a supreme effort of will, she reached out with an inverted web of air, wrapped it around one of the leashed, and crushed her where she stood. 4. She thanked the light for her angriel. She needed to evade. Taija opened a gateway, a step to the side, and she was back at ground level, pulling lightning from the sky, filament thin webs of fire, water, air, and spirit, linking the clouds to her target's potential. Difference between cloud and ground instantly multiplied. A torrent of bolts rained down, hard to count, hard to even watch. The first few vanished, but then the attacks on her started slackening off. More bolts struck a barrier of air above the leashed, but she kept up the onslaught. Thunder, a constant rumble. It was sudden when their shield failed. 1 second she was still slicing and blocking webs of fire. The next, the only sound was explosions as the storm of lightning devastated the Cinchen position. 0. The remaining soldiers broke, dropping weapons and sprinting for the docks. Taija didn't have the energy left to do anything about them, even if she wanted to. In fact, she was struggling to stay standing. Gasping for breath, she staggered over to a wall and sunk down against it, pulling her thighs to her chest, the cobbled ground cold under her. Flashes of light illuminated the duel still continuing on in the sky, and she could hear battle going on somewhere else in the mist. Whoever else was out, they would have to do without her. Taija wasn't sure she could safely channel enough to defend herself against a man with a knife, let alone an army or other channelers. Nevertheless, her eyes were drawn back up to the sky, where Ishmael was still fighting his insane duel with Rand, neither seemingly able to overcome the other. She gave herself a shake. She couldn't sit there and let the boy die tangled up in one of Ishmael's schemes. She didn't know what was going on, but she'd done what she needed to. The girls were free, and as many of the other slaves as she could help too. Siwon could manage the Black Adger now that she had the tools to do it. Ishmael was clearly toying with the boy, or else he'd already be dead, but Taija wasn't sure why. She'd never been in Ishmael's league, and an untrained boy like Rand certainly wasn't. In the end, though, she couldn't just sit and watch him get killed to sate Ishmael's desire for power. She hadn't found much she liked in this light-forsaken age. The girls, Rand, Alexei, Benny, that was about it. The world was a lonely place, and Taija was very, very tired. She doubted it would work, but maybe it would give Rand a chance to escape. Taija levered herself up to her feet, lining her mind's eye up with the two duelists. They separated for a second, and Rand grinned, a disturbing rictus, raising his sword above his head. The trickle of Sedar running through Taija deepened as she drew through her angriel, and she achingly slowly spun balefire, trying to ignore the violent spikes of pleasure pain in her head that told her she was pushing herself far too far. Then it all happened at once. Ishmael struck like a snake, plunging his staff into Rand's side, and at the same time Rand's sword flashed down. With a deafening screech, Ishmael vanished, and Rand slowly collapsed, fading from the sky, the mysterious fog already dissipating. Taija mirrored him, Sedar slipping out of her like water between her fingers. She fell slowly to her knees and then onto her hands. Everything seemed to hurt. She could taste bile in her mouth, and a second later she emptied the contents of her stomach onto the ground. Then, finally, gasping for breath, she fell over, rolling onto her back and lying there on the cold cobbles, staring into the darkening sky. After Egwene left, Min sat looking down at Rand's sleeping form, her hand on his. She wanted to cry, whether with frustration, despair, or relief she wasn't sure. At least he was alive. What would Egwene have said if I'd told her there was another woman yet to come? She sighed. Or will you try to dandle all three of us on your knee? It may not be your fault, Randall Thor, but it isn't fair. Min jumped as she heard movement from the other bed, looking over to see the Aes Sedai, Taija, lying there wrapped in blankets looking over at the two of them with her dark eyes. Min hadn't seen what the woman had done. She'd never even met the woman before, but her warder Alexei had carried her here, utterly insistent that she needed a proper bed far from the damning kennels. Had she been imprisoned there? Since then, Falme had descended into chaos. Min had seen the burnt and broken charnel house that was the square outside the kennels. She'd seen death before, but seeing that she'd struggled not to vomit. Perrin had gently told her not to go inside the kennels, that everyone who could be saved had gotten out, and she'd quickly agreed once she realized what he was really trying to tell her. Was that Taija? Did Rand do it? A man who could channel the dragon reborn? She had no doubt that he could. It made more sense than the small, barely conscious Aes Sedai. She'd seen what Aes Sedai could do, what they would do, and it wasn't that. I hadn't realized you were awake. How are you feeling, Taija Sedai? Min got up and walked over to her. Can I get you anything? Another strange thing about her, whenever Min looked at Taija, unlike every other Aes Sedai, she never saw anything. No images, no hints at the future, just a woman. Taija winced and tried to lever herself up in the bed. Some water, please. Her voice rasped. She looked a mess even after Moiraine had healed her, and it had been such a relief to see that particular Aes Sedai. Even she'd been shocked at the state of Falme, her normal serenity briefly breaking as she looked around tight-lipped while the surviving Sheenarans helped move Rand and Taija to safety. Of course, Taija Sedai. Min headed off to find some water, but by the time she returned with a jug of water, Taija had fallen back asleep, so Min turned back to the man she'd been contemplating. What am I going to do with you, Randall Thor? Not Randall Thor. Min leapt up, grabbing her knife at the musical voice. Luz Thurin Telemann, the dragon reborn. A stunningly beautiful woman glided into the room, clad in white and silver. Min had never seen anyone more beautiful. W, who are you? The woman simply ignored her, glancing down at Taija with a brief look of distaste before stopping by Rand and leaning down to look at him more closely. The woman spoke quietly, but Min could still hear her. Luz Thurin, you know now, but you still do not believe it. No matter, I will continue to guide you to become who you are meant to be. Ishmael may think he is in control, but he will learn. Min found her voice. Who are you? What are you doing here? In a decisive movement, the woman straightened up and met Min's eyes with a beautiful smile. I am Lanfear girl. Terror spiked through Min, and she shook her head in denial, but the woman just smiled calmly. Remember, Luz Thurin is mine, but I will leave him in your care until I come for him. Now, Lanfear turned towards the unconscious Taija, and suddenly there was a much uglier look on her face. Lanfear took a step towards Taija, then another until she loomed over her. Min stood rooted to the spot, too scared to do anything other than watch. The air seemed to shift around Taija, her blankets tightening around her in silent compression. How fortuitous for fate to have delivered you to me like this. Lanfear reached down to gently trail her fingers down Taija's cheek onto her neck. It was not a comforting gesture. Too bad that you will not be awake to experience this, but I have business to attend to. Her eyes flashed, and then she hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before her musical laughter chimed out across the room. You know, Taija, maybe not this time. She pulled away from the unconscious Aes Sedai with a harsh smile. It was still beautiful. I think perhaps the cruelest thing I can do is to let you live just a little longer. Yes, I expect next time I will rid the world of your presence, but for now, I will just watch and enjoy. Oh yes, I will enjoy it. Still laughing to herself, Lanfear stepped through a hole in the air and vanished. Chapter 30. Interlude Romans 6 Reactions. Chapter text Interlude Romans 6 Reactions. Slowly but surely word of what had happened in Falme started to spread around the world. She delicately picked her way through the ruins of Falme's center. She had already seen the little that was left of the town's second largest palace. Scant as they were, melted walls and little else. That had been terrifying. She could not even start to work out how that had been done. But now, seeing the street and square outside the damning kennels, that was worse. Everywhere buildings bore scars or simply holes ripped out of them. The ground itself was pockmarked with blackened craters. In front of the main entrance, there was a huge gouge torn from the cobbles. That was not what disturbed her, though. She was a hard woman. She had seen battles, traveled through the blight. On the surface, this was no worse. The cobbles were stained dark with blood and bodies lay all around, staring empty-eyed at the sky, where they were sufficiently intact to actually be recognizable for what they were anyway. Trollocs taking a village would do just as bad. What was worse, that it had been done with the power, and as far as she could tell, one woman had done this. Simply swatted a huge palace out of existence, and after looking at the ruins, she suspected that at a different angle, from a different direction, that could have been far worse, and then slaughtered her way through a veritable army of channelers and soldiers without even breaking a stride. Her suspicion that Taija knew how to travel had been confirmed by the rescued damning. Oh, how she hated that word. The three girls had been surprisingly tight-lipped, though. She wished she had the time to give the girls more leeway. What Egwene and Nynaeve had experienced would have broken many sisters. She suspected poor Rima would never be the same again, but she did not. The dragon was paramount, and everything else would have to be secondary. As for Taija, she had healed her, of course. The woman had been unconscious by the time she was brought to her, yet surprisingly intact, all things considered. No permanent injuries as far as she could tell. Not for the first time she wondered whether she should have healed Taija. Whether an accident might have better been arranged. She had learned much over the last few months, but was under no illusion as to how a fight between them would go. A shudder at the memory of Fal Dara was expertly suppressed. It was not that she thought Taija was a dark friend. That much was clear. The woman had surely proved her innocence of that, and regardless, she was a terrible actor. It was doubtful she could keep even someone as naive as Rand fooled for long. No, the problem was her influence over Rand and everyone else around her. her willingness to resort to brutal violence and to kill without hesitation when she deemed it necessary. Rand would need to learn, need to become strong, but were those the lessons she wanted him to learn? Perhaps it would be necessary, but she was not sure she wanted those lessons coming from Taija either. It was fortunate that she had arrived in Falme when she had. Clearly the wheel weaved as it willed, but in this case it will seem to be that she would be able to assist and guide young Rand. Equals. For the first time in weeks, she was starting to feel like life might be all right. Egwene and Nynaeve were free. Taija had woken up again, and the Seanchan had been pushed back into the sea. Aes Sedai had wanted to start heading for the tower right away, but Taija had said she would return the three of them herself when she felt up to channeling again. She knew Taija saw her as a girl. She still had not quite forgiven the woman for leaving her behind when she went into Falme, but whatever her age, she could read between the lines and spot the political plays well enough. Taija's offer very clearly did not include Verin. In her heart of hearts, she was secretly glad Taija had made her stay behind. She had asked Nynaeve what had happened, and the woman had closed off so fast it was like a door slamming in her face. She still saw Nynaeve staring into the distance sometimes when no one was around, just sitting and staring with haunted eyes. If only she could get her hands on the Seanchan who had done this to her friends. Egwene had told her some of it, though. Certainly not everything, maybe not much. She knew that, but enough. In some ways, the worst part had been Egwene describing how much she wanted to kill her Soldum, the satisfaction of beating her, the feeling of guilt as she did it. She had told her that Taija had stopped her, with a gentleness they just did not associate with the woman, and then she had done something while Egwene was not looking, just killed the helpless Soldum. In cold blood. She struggled to get her head around that. The woman surely deserved to die, but the way Egwene had described it, Taija had not even reacted, not shown any sign at all that she was killing someone while she comforted Egwene. Surely that was not right, not normal. It was not how it was in the stories. Nynaeve, on the other hand, had firmly told her she did not want to know what the battle had been like. At the time she was furious. She needed to know. Of course she hid it. The poor woman had suffered enough, but she liked to listen and pay attention, so she knew enough. She had seen the Sheenarans' queasy looks when they first came back from the direction of the damning kennels, hardened veterans, all of them. Heard them talking in whispered tones. They clammed up if she came too close, but even then the snippets she did catch made it seem far less exciting and brave. Charnel House. Never seen anything like it. Soldum just smeared across a wall and the smell of burnt flesh. Then there was Taija herself. She was still bedridden 3 days later, but at least she was awake. In better condition than Rand, really, and was that not mad? Seeing him again, and not only that, finding out he was the dragon reborn. She still had not quite processed that properly. It was strange seeing Taija laid up in bed. She was normally so energetic, going from relaxed absent-mindedness to impatient command and back in seconds, and it was painful seeing her clearly suffering. She had been healed by Aes Sedai, who had seemed to pop up out of nowhere after the battle, but Aes Sedai had explained to her and Egwene that some injuries could not be healed so easily, and when a woman overstrained herself too far with the power, she needed time to recover. She also still had not managed to work out exactly what Taija was. Clearly, she must be an Aes Sedai. He seemed to know the Amulin, and neither Aes Sedai nor Verin Sedai denied her status. She knew from her lessons that the White Tower reacted very poorly to impersonators. However, she did not have the ageless face or even a great serpent ring, and perhaps more importantly, she did not act like an Aes Sedai. Not in the slightest. Of course, some of the greens and browns lacked the composure of most, but they had their own quirks, and it just did not fit. It was frustrating, and she hated not knowing. One thing she was sure of, though, was that without Taija she would eventually have been caught and faced the same fate as Egwene and Nynaeve. Each night she'd hear Egwene's stifling sobs late from the room next door when she thought everyone was asleep. It broke her heart, but she knew her friend would be mortified if she knew she had heard. Regardless, whatever Taija's relationship with the other Aes Sedai was, it worried her. Verin Sedai seemed oblivious to everything that did not come out of a book, but the speculative looks that Aes Sedai gave the woman were concerning. More, Aes Sedai regularly went to visit Taija, and when she left, Taija always seemed more tired, somehow sadder if that was possible. Why did she always seem to have such an underlying sadness to her? Yet another mystery. That was why on the third day after the battle she decided. Taija clearly was not in a position to look after herself yet, and who knew what Moirain's intentions were. She had heard of Aes Sedai, of course she had, but reputation told her little. She was not a naive girl. She knew that every Aes Sedai had their own agenda. She was not sure how she would stand up to an Aes Sedai like Moirain if it came to it, but she would try. That night she gathered her bedding and moved to Taija's room. She might not be able to fight like her, but she could still protect her until she recovered. To her surprise, she found Alexei standing outside the door, staff in hand, but he just glanced at her and smiled before stepping aside. She quietly pushed open the door to find Taija propped up in her bed and Egwene sitting on her own bedding on the floor talking to her. Taija looked up at her and dropped her face into her hands, speaking in her odd accent. "Oh no, not you two. Fucking paranoid teenagers." She spoke the old tongue reasonably well, but she knew she had a lot to learn from Taija, who seemed to have a truly colloquial grasp of it. Frack's sake, she almost silently murmured to herself that night. She didn't quite have the pronunciation right, but she would get it. She gave the girls a placid smile. "You must be looking forward to returning to the tower to continue your lessons. It is not good for you children to be away from the tower. Now, where did I leave my notes? I had asked Tomas to make me a sketch of the town's bell tower, and he will be back soon." She bustled away, nodding absently to various people as she went. She really must find out more about this Taija. She clearly was no Aes Sedai, but it seemed that she had all of them at a disadvantage. The kind of disadvantage that made you call someone whatever they wanted to be called. She had visited the town center, seen the havoc that woman and wrought. There were not many sights that could turn her stomach, not after the things she had done, but it had still been shocking. Fascinating, of course, but disturbing that one unknown woman could do that. Of course, she said unknown, but intriguingly Moiraine seemed to know more about her. If only that woman was not always so tight-lipped. No matter. Of course, Taija was not capable of doing much more than sit up in bed for now, so perhaps it would be opportune to take some action before she recovered. It was important that the boy be guided safely to his ultimate destiny, and young Taija might be an obstacle to that. Perhaps an as yet undetected complication. She considered it as she exchanged a few words with one of the Sheenarans. No, better not to. She would see how things came together, and maybe this Taija would be a useful piece in the game. Now where had Tomas got to? So it is finally happening. He sneered. The boy has revealed himself. This is all as expected, though. Why are you so angry? He asked the tall, dark woman. She really was angrier than he had ever seen her, practically vibrating. Even the other woman had sat further away from her than usual. Do you know what actually happened there? Are you blind? She practically bit the words out. Luz Thurin reborn, we know. The smaller woman was clearly irritated, judging by her tone. As we agreed, we don't tread on each other's toes, so beyond the headlines, no, we don't know what actually happened. Was it Ishmael again? You won't believe what he's just done in the White. No, it was not Ishmael, although it is his fault. The taller woman took a breath and got himself back under control. The whole return has been thrown back into the sea, a huge setback. I have been having to piece together reports from fleeing soldiers, barely a servant of the great lord among them, but it was a disaster beyond anything I could have expected. The boy defeated Ishmael in a duel above the sky above the town, and the Tseentchen broke. His tone was unimpressed. It was not the boy. Yes, all right, clearly that had an effect, and there were reports of a mysterious army too. Main power of the Tseentchen, though, is the Damin, their ever-victorious army. There was definitely a hint of contempt in her tone. Relies on leashed channelers to crush the opposition. She continued without stopping for breath. You remember the last time we met, we worked out Ishmael had kidnapped those girls from the White Tower. Well, someone or something came after them. The other woman waved a hand dismissively. Well, that's interesting, but I don't know why it's enough to call an emergency meeting. If you let me finish, then you will see why quickly enough. While Ishmael was playing at swords with Luz Thurin, must you scowl every time I say his name? She snapped at him. As I was saying, when Ishmael was playing at swords, someone slaughtered their way through the Damin kennels, freed a group of them, and proceeded to kill their way through every Tseentchen they saw. He shrugged dismissively. Impressive for one of this age's so-called Aes Sedai, but I think any of us could do the same. A painful setback, and you have my sympathies, but we have all survived worse. I would agree with you, but for two things. One, the attack seems to have begun with the obliteration of High Lady Seroth's palace. No, let me finish. I mean obliteration. The place was vaporized. The only surviving witness I could find perfectly described a gateway opening in front of the palace followed by blinding light. He will certainly never see again. Ah, that is more concerning. He paused. Do you think it was Lanfear? Or maybe Samil? I do not think any of the rest. It was not Lanfear or Samil. The tall woman cut him off. You understand few damning were left to report back after this, and trying to extract coherent answers from ignorant non-channelers can be difficult, however willing they are to talk. I did obtain some useful information, though. Firstly, while everybody seems to disagree on what they looked like, there does seem to be a consensus that it was a small woman. Certainly Sedar was being channeled, although I suspect many of the webs were inverted. Samil would struggle to spin a convincing illusion of that. I also have my doubts he could have staged the initial attack. Second, this woman used gateways constantly. From what I can tell, it was classic light-bringer tactics, although no sign of a full team. We all know Lanfear prefers to just rely on her strength and then power through whatever is in her way. There was a long, contemplative pause before eventually the shorter woman broke the silence. I suppose we'll need to be thinking about anti-traveling wards again. She shuddered ever so slightly. Those are not experiences I want to relive. He sighed. Yes, indeed, we will all need to adjust our plans. I see what you meant now, though. He nodded to the taller woman. The real question is who? She sat at her desk, trying to read through the piles of reports she received. Having so many eyes and ears spread out through the world was vital, but it used inordinate amounts of her time. However, regardless of how hard she tried, she kept coming back to one. A report from Falmy. It came accompanied by a sketch of a young man fighting a flaming figure in the sky. Another false dragon declaring himself. Another filthy male channeler spreading their curse across the world. This one support seemed to be spreading incredibly fast, bringing madness to the West at an unprecedented rate. The Red Adger would need to act fast. Of course, she dismissed the reports of these Shinshin with Aes Sedai on leashes. A male channeler of this boy's apparent power was bad enough without subscribing to ridiculous rumors. But then there was one other thing in the report that took it beyond being yet another false dragon. Rumors of a Taija Sedai assisting him to free the leashed Aes Sedai. Again, ridiculous, but she at least knew that this Taija was real. Wherever she appeared, it seemed there were problems, and they continued to get worse. She had been sure for a while, but this confirmed it. A dark friend, like so many others inside the tower and out. If Taija had this false dragon under influence, then things must be worse than she had feared. Action would need to be taken for the light. One thing had been clear as soon as Semirage turned up in an absolute temper, barking questions at him. There was something going on. However much he assured her he had not been in Falmy recently, or ever, and in fact had never heard of the place until she so rudely interrupted his dinner. She seemed particularly difficult to mollify. Even he shuddered at the thought of what a proper interrogation from her would be like, not that she would ever get the chance. If it came to it, he would smash her the same way he had beaten so many other enemies. Regardless, their status protected them both from each other, or at least from overactions, and so she was restricted to angry words and him to irritated retorts. It seemed that the others were worked up like a flock of Akin over Luz Thurin's return to this Falmy. His mouth twisted downwards, that would be dealt with in due course. He was a patient man, and he had known the rebirth was coming regardless. There was no benefit in taking precipitous action. Much more interesting was what Semirage's barely polite interrogation had implied beyond the defeat of Ishmael. When he'd heard about that, he'd immediately made his way to Falmy, suitably disguised, of course. There were too many coincidences lining up, and he did not like coincidences. Of course, he also had a vague hope of finding Ishmael in a vulnerable state. If he could ever get that man alone, he had plans for him. Oh yes, him and Lanfear. They'd been a long time coming. One day, but that had been more opportunistic optimism rather than a true plan. Of course, the man had fled to lick his wounds somewhere else. Still, he was glad he'd made the effort to visit Falmy. He'd avoided Luz Thurin's camp, too many of those so-called Aes Sedai, and he suspected there might be a trap being woven there for him. But there was much to see among the gawkers in the town. The scar through the center where a palace once stood was disturbingly familiar, bringing back dark memories of the war. Lanfear could have done it. Maybe Ishmael. Was one of them targeting him, looking to ensnare him with their schemes? Did they know enough to? Lanfear at least did, and he'd learned painful lessons about betting that Ishmael didn't know something. Given that, the damning kennels were of particular interest to him. It was a risk, of course, going into them, but he'd built his life on calculated risks, and this was just one more. Laborers were busily at work, cleaning the place up, not that they were a problem. A judicious web of compulsion on the foreman, and he was quickly getting a personal tour. Despite the work carrying on, there were still distinct signs of battle throughout. Apparently it had been a woman, although no one could agree on her description. Just one, though, that much seemed clear. Removing a glove, he traced his hand down a perfectly smooth groove in a wall. There was no question, a gateway had done that. His experienced eyes ran over the scars and gouges torn from the walls and floor. It looked like the intruder had come in through the main doors, then traveled to behind the defenders and attacked from there. He couldn't be sure, but he was starting to have a painful suspicion that if he'd been there, he'd have seen that mysterious attacker throwing webs from behind, and then attacking straight back through the still open gateway at the same time. It was classic light bringer tactics. None of the others fought like that, but he had no doubt at least a few of them could make a decent attempt at pretending if need be. Memory of a determined face came into his mind, hair gone awry and dark eyes narrowed, lips pursed in concentration as she spun. He pushed it away violently. He still couldn't work out why someone was playing this game, but if they thought they were going to make him stumble, they'd soon learn otherwise. Abruptly, he turned to leave, ignoring his guide's protests. First back east, he was a busy man and had much to do. Then, perhaps it was time to start weaving his own net and see which of them fell into it.